Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one, whoever has seen me has seen the Father, before Abraham was, ego eimi.
His point also holds that the Gospel of John is super late, and none of the other earlier Gospels had ever heard of these things. But also, more importantly, Paul, our source, our earliest source, he'd never heard of this either. He'd never heard of any idea of Jesus being God. It's very clear in Paul that Jesus is a subordinate, a created being of God, right? So he's not identical to God.
And Jesus says to the man, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And Mark records that those standing about murmured and said, who does this man think he is? No one can forgive sins.
He's still a created being. His ability to forgive sins is assigned to him. And so it's not that like somehow Jesus has to physically, literally be God in order to do that. God is God, so he can assign those rights and powers to anyone he wants. And obviously the one he's going to assign that power to is his chosen representative that does it.
Well, all scholars agree that the movement arose because these earliest disciples had suddenly and sincerely come to believe that Jesus had been raised by God from the dead. And that raises then the further question, well, where in the world did they come up with that belief? And I think that the best explanation for the origin of that belief and the transformation in these first disciples is that they were right, that God had raised Jesus from the dead.
It doesn't really support the idea that Jesus really rose from the dead. Is this actually the evidence we would have? And the answer is no. If you've risen from the dead, you could obviously visit everybody and not just isolated few people in visions and dreams.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am joined by the infamous Dr. Richard Carrier. How are you?
Doing well. Enjoying the ice storm out in Georgia right now.
Awesome. Look, I decided to put a project together that I think is unique and different than anything I've done. And each academic is going to individually react to William Lane Craig and Sean McDowell, that is the son of Josh McDowell, both clear, I would say, well-known apologists in the world. And I'm wanting critical scholars to rate, to critique, to highlight all the errors along the way. And there are 15 clips. I'm kind of viewing it as a game. You have no clue what the other scholar said. They have no clue what you're said. Some of them don't even know you're here. You don't know some of them that are there. Anyway.
And I haven't seen the clips either, so this is live reaction.
Live reaction. I think this is going to be fun. And in the end, we're going to put a compilation of all you academics together just to say how much we love apologetics. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Carrier. Before we begin, everybody go check out his blog. Go check him out, support him for his work. He's doing great stuff. And the blog is free. You can go subscribe and read his stuff. If you want to have your comments, you want to join in, you can be a patron. Anyway, all of the promo stuff for Dr. Carrier will be in the description. So if you want to help him out, or if you're impressed by the end of this episode, you know where to find him. Here we go. Are you ready for the game?
I am.
West says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one, whoever has seen me has seen the Father, before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video, but let's just say that they do. Even if this was Jesus explicitly claiming to be God, don't you think it's a bit suspicious that these claims only show up in our latest gospel? If Jesus was known to be walking around claiming explicitly to be God himself, did the other 3 gospel authors just not think this was relevant? A minor, unimportant detail not worth including?
Essentially, here's the key question I'd love for you to weigh in on, Bill. To confidently believe that Jesus is God, do we need explicit first-person claims? And did Jesus adequately claim to be God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which came before John?
In my published work, I've tried to show that historically, Jesus of Nazareth made highly significant Christological claims about himself whereby he put himself in the place of God himself. For example, he claimed to be the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. He claimed to be the Son of God in a unique sense. He claimed to be the divine human Son of Man prophesied by the prophet Daniel. And all of these offices or titles come together at the trial scene in Mark's gospel. The high priest, the leader of the Sanhedrin, charges Jesus under oath, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus responds, "I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." A virtual quotation from Daniel 7. So here you see claims that assert the divinity of Jesus by use of these significant Christological titles. And immediately the high priest and the Sanhedrin recognized the blasphemy of what he had said and condemned him to death.
Alex is entirely right. Like everything he said was correct, including his doubting the interpretations, the apologetical interpretations of the Gospel of John. All of those in the original Greek actually make more sense in the context of ancient Jewish theology. They do not constitute claims that Jesus was God. So even the made up claims that appear in John don't really support that. But his point also holds that the Gospel of John is super late, and none of the other earlier Gospels had ever heard of these things. But also, more importantly, Paul, our source, our earliest source, he'd never heard of this either. He never heard of any idea of Jesus being God. It's very clear in Paul that Jesus is a subordinate, a created being of God, right? So he's not identical to God, but he is assigned the powers and authorities of God, or some of the powers and authorities of God. And this idea, and this, it's noticed in that reaction there that Sean asked Craig to dispute this, and then Craig goes on about how Jesus declared him with himself with all these Christological titles, which aren't claims to be God. They're literally claims not to be God. They're claims to be God's agent, God's son, right? They're all subordinating claims. So even like Craig did not even answer what Sean. Basically, Craig is supporting Alex here, but they're pretending not to. And that's Alex's point, right? Is that this is what Christian apologists do. They take statements in the Bible that are clearly saying completely different thing and try to spin them as saying the thing that they want them to say, but that's actually not what's going on. If you think in terms of like Jesus is putting himself in the place of God, that's also, you could look in Jewish angelology, you have like the Metatron. The Metatron puts himself in the place of God in terms of he's the instrument through which God speaks. So the burning bush was the Metatron, not God really. It was just the angel who's relaying God's instructions, right? When God does something, he does it through the action of angels. Angels go and thus represent God in some respect. The angel of death is the thing that goes around and kills people. God doesn't necessarily just kill them directly. So there are these agents of God that are put in the place of God by God, but they are created beings. They're separate beings. They're not identical. They're not identical to God. And you can see this in Philippians 2, where Paul outright says, like, Jesus is not identical to God. In fact, Jesus chose not to equate himself with God, even when he was a pre-existent supernatural being. Right. And there are other examples in Paul where Jesus is a pre-existent being. He is the creator because God assigned him the role of creation. But that's in Judaism already. Like the idea of the Logos as the agent of creation, already Jewish by the time Christians are writing. This idea, all the attributes that were assigned to Jesus that were supernatural attributes were already assigned to supreme archangels within Judaism. And he's performing the same functions. He's adopting the same titles. So within the context of Judaism, he's not identical to God. And the idea of Jesus being identical to God doesn't really seem to appear until at the earliest, maybe Tertullian, and even that's a little uncertain. And it doesn't become solidified until the Council of Nicaea, when they basically just say, no, he's identical to God, and then try to solve all of the problems that creates a really elaborate Trinitarian doctrine that makes no sense. But that's all late, right? So early Christianity, the New Testament, Jesus is a subordinate being. He's a created being. He's assigned the roles of God. He's basically representing God. He's like God's agent, essentially, right? That doesn't mean he's identical. My agent is not identical to me, but he does represent me. And that's what's going on here. Alex is right about this. And if you notice, the apologists did not respond at all. In fact, the evidence that Craig presented basically backs exactly what Alex just said.
Now, in addition to these explicit claims, there are also implicit Christological claims that Jesus made, whereby he put himself in God's place. For example, his claim to be able to forgive sins. In Mark chapter 2, we have the story of the healing of the paralytic. And Jesus says to the man, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And Mark records that those standing about murmured and said, who does this man think he is? No one can forgive sins, but God alone. And Jesus, knowing what they're saying, says, which do you think is easier? To say your sins are forgiven, or rise, get up, and take your bed and go home? And he says that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He says to the paralytic, I say to you, rise, get up, and go home. And the man is miraculously healed. Clearly in Mark's gospel, this is a claim to divinity, exercising authority to forgive sins, and authority and prerogative.
So that's the same thing that we just talked about before, that the idea that God assigns Jesus a power or a right or a role doesn't make Jesus identical to God. So this idea of implicitly saying that he's identical to God, that's absolutely not what's happening here. Is even just as, William Lane Craig puts it, is like Jesus is being assigned the role, he's being given the authority, but that doesn't make him identical. And so that's why you get the idea that he's the Son of God, he's the chosen one of God, etc. He's still a created being. His ability to forgive sins is assigned to him. And so it's not that like somehow Jesus has to physically, literally be God in order to do that. God is God, so he can assign those rights and powers to anyone he wants. And obviously the one he's going to assign that power to is his chosen representative that does it. And we have things like the idea of atoning for sins. We have, for instance, in Philo, he talks about the angel, the Logos, essentially, this angel that we think early Christians also thought Jesus was. The Logos also atones for human sins in the celestial temple as God's agent. So to this idea that it doesn't have to be God, you can have an angel that's doing it. And that's explicitly in Philo. This is a Jewish theologian of the same period as the origins of Christianity. So that doesn't lead to the conclusion that he's arguing for. And I think that's kind of obscuring the reality here. And I know Dr. Craig has to know this, what I'm telling you. So he's just blowing past the facts that we know and misrepresenting things a certain way. He's basically selling a position, with carefully crafted omissions and carefully crafted implications that don't actually have a logical structure, right? Like he's trying to convince you of this position, and he knows he's keeping information from you, and he knows he's distorting the way the information is being presented. And that I find, it's the thing that annoys me the most about Christian apologetics. And they all do this, but some do it more than others.
I would just add this really quickly before we move to the second one, that I think Mark has a very high Christology. So some of the implicit claims, like even in Mark 1, healing the leper, it's interesting in 2 Kings chapter 5, the king of Israel receives a request to heal Naaman of leprosy, and he says, "Am I God?" There was the sense that only God could heal leprosy. And of course, Jesus does it by his own power immediately without the ritual of Elijah. Go to Mark 2, like you explained, the healing of the paralytic clearly shows. I mean, Michael Bird wrote, he said, Jesus claims for himself an unmediated divine authority that to those steeped in Jewish monotheism looks like absolute blasphemous. You move to Mark chapter 4. Jesus rebukes the winds and the waves, and they immediately become calm. Well, the theme in Psalms is that Yahweh alone controls the sea and other waters. Hence, at the crossing of the Red Sea, we see that portrayed. The Gospels report the disciples saying, "Who then is this that even the wind and sea obey him?" This is reminiscent of the Psalms, "Who is mighty as you are, O Lord." Two more quick examples just to make this, and these are only a few of them, as you know. The demoniac bows down to Jesus. Now, what's interesting context is he was not showing respect, but fear on behalf of the large number of demons possessing him in the thousands. This army of 2,000 or more demons was deathly afraid of Jesus, and he falls prostrate in an act of worship of a supernatural power, even greater than a legion of demons. And then finally, like you said, these implicit claims come to be explicit in Mark 14, where Jesus claims to be the divine figure, the Son of Man. And I think just to buttress this case, he comes on the clouds, divine status, served by all nations, and will have an everlasting universal kingdom. So I think the earliest Christology is a high Christology.
So that's doing the same thing. They're confusing early high Christology with Trinitarianism. This is a very common mistake or deliberate obfuscation of Christian apologists. Early high Christology, and that Mark probably believed in an early high Christology, that's all true. And I think the evidence is very strongly supports this. All the leading literature, there's 12, latest peer-reviewed monographs on this, supporting that high Christology is original. It goes all the way back to Paul and probably the first apostles. The problem is that high Christology does not mean identicality. It's not the same thing as Trinitarianism. It's the same thing that Philo is talking about, where you have the logos, that God assigns this supreme archangel it gives him all these particular duties and assignments and powers and rights. And the idea of God using agents, the angels, to do things is well established. So this idea that it would be blasphemous for Jesus to say that, God has bestowed upon me the power to cure a leper directly, that's not blasphemous at all. That's commonly believed that people could do that. And certainly an angel could do that, right? That's what God does. He assigns these tasks to angels. So it's not blasphemous to say that an angel was given a God's power or God's right or whatever, appointed that, assigned that by God. That's not blasphemous at all. Nor is it blasphemous for a human to claim that he's an angel. It might be false, it might be a lie or whatever, but it's not blasphemy to do that, because you're not claiming to be God. You're claiming to have the authority of God, but then, anybody who claims to be appointed by God, to be, anointed by God, is claiming that same thing. And the same goes with the bowing. The idea of bowing to an angel who representative of God, especially a Metatron, but any angel, the idea of bowing to angels because they represent the majesty of God. Doesn't mean you're worshiping the angel. Doesn't mean you're placing the angel on equation with God. You're bowing to the presence of the Lord through the presence of his agent. And that's standard in Judaism at the time. There's nothing blasphemous or weird about that. That fits completely in the context of Jewish thought.
Anyway, Wes also mentioned how it was amazing that the early church grew from 11 scared disciples to overhauling the Roman world. On this, the sociologist Rodney Stark estimates that in its first 300 years, Christianity grew at a rate of 40% per decade, from a small group in the 1st century to 3 million in the 4th century. That sounds pretty impressive, until you learn that this is the same growth rate experienced by Mormonism since its foundation in the 19th century. So if the rate of Christianity's growth is good evidence of its truth, Mormonism just became a whole lot more plausible.
Here's the root of the question I'm curious for you to weigh in on. Is the amazing growth of Christianity a good argument for Christianity? If so, what about the growth of Mormonism?
Here, my sympathies are with Alex. I do not think that you can simply point to the growth in the size of a movement as a good argument for the truth of the founding principles of that movement. Islam would be another counterexample. Islam grew tremendously after Muhammad and took over much of the world, even threatened the Christian West. And so it's simply not true that the success of a movement is indicative of the truth of that, of what the movement stands for. Rather, in my published work, I've tried to recast this consideration in terms of explaining the very origin of the Christian movement itself. What I mean is this: we know that Christianity sprang into being sometime about mid-first century. Where did it come from? What caused this movement to arise? Well, all scholars agree that the movement arose because these earliest disciples had suddenly and sincerely come to believe that Jesus had been raised by God from the dead. And that raises then the further question, well, where in the world did they come up with that belief? And I think that the best explanation for the origin of that belief and the transformation in these first disciples is that they were right, that God had raised Jesus from the dead.
I think, in fairness, Wes would agree with you. I don't think he was necessarily saying that this amazing growth proves Christianity is true. I think he's saying this requires an explanation from 11 scared disciples to overhauling the Roman world. So I really think it would line up with your point. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, numbers alone are not, they don't prove that something is true or not. I mean, if stats are right, by 2070, Islam could be larger than Christianity. Does that prove it's true? Of course not. But I think we don't have to do this here, but we could look at some of the differences between even the growth of Christianity, completely unexpected in Christianity, versus the opportunities to grow in the 19th century with kind of a Christian framework in the burned over district which Mormonism came from. We could splice some of those differences, but I don't think it's really relevant. The big question is what explains this growth?
Yeah.
And they consistently pointed to the claim that Jesus had died, risen from the grave, and appeared to them. I think that's the heart of it. Really, really well said.
Yeah, notice the goalpost moving there. So they agree with that, everything Alex said, basically. Alex wasn't even talking about this other question of why did the first apostles arise? Like I'm sure he talks about that separately. But they're trying to replace his argument with a different argument and trying to win that different argument while agreeing with Alex. So I think, yeah, they're right. The idea that the growth of Christianity is unusual is not true. And so it actually is not unusually persuasive. It has the same amount of persuasiveness as every other false religion that has been successful. So that's the key thing there. Trying to move it back to what convinced the original apostles, that's now you're talking about a different thing, right? So now you're saying, why did they come to believe the things that they believed? And then you get into they tell you, they say, well, we found these weird hidden messages in scripture and God came to us in a dream or a vision and told us, right? Or Jesus did. Which is the same way all false religions begin, right? Islam, it's the angel Gabriel came to me and dictated the Quran. Mormonism, it's the angel Moroni came to me and dictated the thing or showed me the golden tablets or whatever. And that's where all this stuff came from. You can look at any other these sort of evangelical religions that are based on visions, and you see the same thing over and over again. You see lots of cults try to get started this way, and obviously statistically, some of them are going to succeed, and so there's nothing indicative of that suggests that the thing really happened. And then you get into the whole question of it doesn't really support the idea that Jesus really rose from the dead. Is this actually the evidence we would have? And the answer is no. If you've risen from the dead, you could obviously visit everybody and not just isolated few people in visions and dreams. You could visit everybody. You could visit the courts of Asia. You could visit the courts of Rome. You could visit leaders. You could tour the world saying, hey, I rose from the dead. Here's some things you need to know. You could fly through the air to do it, to prove that you're a supernaturally risen being. You could have people try to kill you and your body's invincible. Look at that. So there's a lot of things that you could do with this. But what would you expect if this was not a real resurrection? You would expect there to be none of this evidence. You'd expect it to only be private visions that no one can verify or falsify because you don't have access to the inside mind of these people who experienced Jesus in these revelations. And Paul, throughout his epistles, talks about these are experiences internally. He hears the voice of Jesus inside him. It's not an experience. He did not encounter flesh and blood. It's not an encounter with a man. It's a revelation, etc. And he says even, the whole gospel is known through scripture and revelation. In other words, finding secret messages, tea leaf reading of the scriptures, secret messages on scriptures and revelations. There's no other evidence that Paul ever refers to as convincing anyone. So that establishes that. So that kind of eliminates that. But there's a bigger problem here, which is that the original apostolic faith did not succeed. It completely failed and died out. What happened was you had this original religion, which was the Jewish movement. Paul comes along and decides to market it to Gentiles, and then the Gentile church is the one that grew like Mormonism. The original church, the original Jewish church, completely failed. It shrank, and disappeared. Unless it went on to become Islam, there's some interesting possibilities that a remnant of the original Torah sect is what actually eventually evolved into Islam. We don't know that. We can't prove that, but there are some hints of that being the case. But even so, it only succeeded by becoming Islam, if that were the case. Whereas Christianity is a Gentile religion that basically completely abandoned everything that was originally taught by the faith. They abandoned the subordinationism, so they adopted Trinitarianism instead. That's complete blasphemy compared to what Paul or any other original apostle would have thought. They abandoned Torah observance. It's no longer an actual Jewish sect. It's no longer obedient to the law. It's completely abandoning Judaism, essentially, except for its scriptures. And so on. You can go down the line. The religion that survived is a distorted mutant of the original religion. And therefore, you can't really appeal to what the first apostles encountered or experienced or whatever to explain all the subsequent growth, because all the subsequent growth belongs to a completely different heretical offshoot of the church that has nothing to do with the original, other than, building on these basic ideas. And that gets to the point that even, whatever the first apostles saw, and I do like that he said 11 and not 12, even though Paul says all 12 saw Jesus risen from the dead, because it's kind of eliding the fact that Paul has no knowledge of a Judas. But anyway, so there are a lot of problems in there. But this idea that that whatever the first apostles saw, that can't translate to the future, right? It's like if you go 2 generations out, end of the 1st century, no one in that century has access to these guys. No one they have access, nor do they have access to whatever evidence they had. It's all gone by then. So any growth after the 1st century for Christianity cannot be credited to whatever amazing evidence existed in the early century. So Craig's point is completely irrelevant to Alex's point and cannot rescue the Christian argument from what Alex is saying.
We actually have 11 eyewitnesses to the Mormon golden plates, whose names and written testimonies we still have today. 3 of those witnesses say that they saw the angel Moroni give Joseph Smith the plates with their own eyes. And even when they fell out with Joseph Smith and left the church, they still continued to assert that they had witnessed these events. We don't have anything like this kind of extant written testimony for the resurrection of Jesus.
Kevin Harris and I did a Reasonable Faith podcast on this question recently, and I think the very simple answer is that Joseph Smith and these early witnesses were charlatans. I'm sure that Alex would agree with that assessment, that these men were not sincerely mistaken that they had seen the golden plates. Rather, they were just lying about what they saw. I think that is the correct and plausible explanation of this circumstance. But notice that explanation, when you try to carry it over to the first disciples of Jesus, it becomes completely untenable. No scholar today would support the old deistic theory that the earliest disciples stole the body of Jesus and then lied about the resurrection appearances. So while this alternative, or explanation rather, is plausible for these Mormon witnesses, I think it would be completely untenable with regard to the earliest disciples of Christ.
There's 2 excellent articles and podcasts on this in the Mormon Research Ministry that Bill McKeever's put together. And he basically really summed this up well. He said, Mormons believe the 11 witnesses saw the golden plates with their natural eyes. But a careful reading of Mormon documents themselves actually reveals a different account. According to Doctrine and Covenants, the only way these so-called witnesses could be allowed to see the plates was with faith. Faith was a prerequisite to seeing them, which is interesting. There's deep contradictory evidence, whether it was with their natural or, quote, spiritual eyes, meaning it seems to be the claims were more of a vision than empirically, so to speak. So David Whitner himself said, "We did not touch nor handle the plates." So Bill McKeever concludes, and he has a very careful article. He cites all the early sources themselves. We can link to this. I'd invite viewers to go watch it. His conclusion is, while they all, the 11 witnesses, claimed to have handled what they were told were ancient plates, they did so while the plates were covered up and not visible. If Mormons want to insist that a person can't be considered an eyewitness to the authenticity of the golden plates unless they actually saw them, then there were no eyewitnesses to Joseph Smith's gold plates. I think that really captures it.
Yeah, this idea that faith is a prerequisite, that was also an ancient Christian idea. Origen said that the resurrected body of Jesus could only be seen with the eye of faith, for example. So they had the exact same excuses back then for Christianity. It's funny that this argument is self-refuting in the sense that Craig is saying it is implausible while describing a completely successful example of it. So clearly it is plausible in the sense that all the Mormons believed it and kept believing it, and it grew and grew and grew after that, right? So it is plausible because it worked. We have a working model of it actually succeeding, so that you have the claims exist. We can explain the claims with this charlatan argument. We can explain the growth. We can explain everything with this. So it clearly is plausible. This idea that it's not plausible in the case of Christianity is not correct, especially since we have less evidence for the origins of Christianity than we have for Mormonism. The reason we can establish charlatanry in the case of Mormonism is we have so much good documentation from the actual people involved from the very first time. We don't have any of that we have no eyewitness testimony at all, or even contemporary testimony other than Paul. And Paul, of course, he's the latecomer. He's the one who sees Jesus in a vision, etc. And what Paul tells us is it's all a vision in exactly the same sense that he's talking about here. Now, that does raise the question, is Paul a charlatan? Are the apostles charlatans? Are they pretending to have visions? That's entirely possible. It's entirely compatible with the evidence. And in the same way that's compatible with the evidence for Mormonism. It worked for Mormonism. It would work for Christianity. But we have countless other religious movements that have these experiences and completely believe them and are motivated by them. Some are more successful than others. And we have lots of this. So in my book on the historicity of Jesus, I have in chapter 4 in element 15, I have a whole section where I summarize and detail the scientific evidence. We have a lot of science of religious movements, religious visions, the hallucinations, the dreams, how people come to believe that they're honest, right? They're real. They don't have to be charlatans. They can sincerely believe that when Jesus appeared to them in a dream, that it really was Jesus. And we don't have to doubt that they made that up. They just aren't rational people, right? So they aren't thinking like, oh, that has to just be a dream. No, they have these preset beliefs that if a God appears to you, if a divine being appears to you in a dream, that it's real. And so therefore, whatever they say must be true. And they have other things that will convince them of that. Like if they feel in their heart that it feels right, then that's the Holy Spirit telling them that it's true. Goes back to William Lane Craig's point. If the Holy Spirit tells you it's true, then forget the evidence. All the evidence can be rejected if the Holy Spirit tells you it's true. Well, this is what's going on. It's like the idea, if you have this emotional feeling that it must be true, you'll credit that as the Holy Spirit confirming that it's true. And then you go on believing it. So you don't need charlatanry, although that would work. You could explain the origins of Christianity that way. But you can also explain it in terms of like these sincere visions. They actually do think they're finding hidden messages from God in the scriptures. They actually do think that dreaming appearances of Jesus, having a conversation with Jesus in your head, is really having a conversation with Jesus in your head. So we have tons of scientific evidence of both models working, both models being involved in the origins of Christianity, and both models fit all the evidence we have for Christianity, because we have almost no useful evidence for the origins of Christianity. I mean, Paul is almost our only source, really. And you'll notice that this is the little trick that's happened in this clip, is that I don't know if you notice, but they are just automatically assuming that the Gospels are 100% accurate eyewitness reports of what happened. So they're assuming that, like Craig assumes there's an empty tomb. So he assumes that they must have stolen the body. None of these assumptions are valid. There's actually didn't have to be an empty tomb. Paul actually says the body that dies is not the body that rises. So it's entirely possible that they thought Jesus jumped into a new body and left the old one behind, so the tomb doesn't have to be empty. It's also possible the tomb wasn't empty, because any body that's in the tomb, and even if you believe it, the tomb has to be empty for Jesus to rise from the dead, who are you going to believe if you're a fanatical, faithful person who's been told by the Holy Spirit that it's true? you just say the authorities drag out the body and say, well, that's just some other body. You're just faking it. You put a body in the tomb. Like they would have all these excuses to explain away anything like that. And so and Paul never references the empty tomb as evidence. Even when he's describing the nature of the resurrection body, which you would think that'd be an important piece of information, that the resurrection body, oh, it's the same one. Don't worry. We know this because the tomb was empty. No, he doesn't. Paul has no knowledge of there ever being spied an empty tomb. So, but even again, like even if there was a tomb and there was a body in it, there's a million ways that the faithful would explain that away, and so we can't use that as evidence. But also, it's the thing is that they're not claiming to have seen the corpse rise up and come talk to them, right? Paul is saying it came to me in a vision or a dream. It wasn't flesh and blood. It wasn't with a man. It was with, basically what was then a celestial being, and so the apostles would have seen it the same way. So there's no need for an empty tomb for them, right? Like if Jesus comes to you and says, "Hey, I rose from the dead," you don't need an empty tomb. The Holy Spirit has now confirmed to you that, oh my God, he really rose from the dead. And so that's the kind of thing that the trick that's going on there is conflating what the Gospels say with what Paul says, and that's not the case. The Gospels are decades later in a foreign language, written in a foreign land by foreigners, not witnesses or anything like that. And they're inherently fabulous, right? Whereas Paul is giving us a much more realistic picture of how the religion began because it fits scientific evidence of how other revelatory religions begin. It looks exactly the same, right? So when you set those two apart and you just look at Paul, you go, well, actually, we're getting closer to the truth in Paul, and we can almost see the truth there. We almost have enough information to see that this religion started the same way as all other religions. The complete conviction of its followers is based on the same kind of thing. That When Prophecy Fails is that famous book that began the theory of cognitive dissonance, studies one of these UFO cults that had this exact same phenomenon. And we even have references to this like in the Gospels. So you have like in Matthew at the end when Jesus appears risen, Matthew says some of the disciples doubted. It says some of them didn't believe it. And then some of the other Gospels talk about Jesus being in a different form that no one recognized him, but they're still convinced it's Jesus, right? So we have evidence here that there were people that weren't buying it. Just like with When Prophecy Fails, with that UFO cult, some of them left and said, I'm not convinced anymore. But some of them doubled down. Even with solid evidence against them, they reinterpreted everything and got even more faithful, even stronger in their conviction, and kept trying to evangelize the religion. And then the question of whether the religion succeeds, whether you can successfully market it after that, has to do with factors completely unrelated to the original reasons for becoming or forming the religion.
Because the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things.
Okay, it gets a bit speculative here. Scholarly consensus is that the earliest gospel, Mark, was written around 70 AD. This is some 40 years after Jesus died, and likely after the death of most of the eyewitnesses, given life expectancy in the ancient world. But even if it were written earlier, even if it were written by Mark himself, we're talking about the resurrection here. And notice that the earliest version of Mark's Gospel does not contain any descriptions of post-resurrection appearances. It ends with the empty tomb and a disappeared Jesus and suggests that he will appear to people, but it doesn't record those appearances. So even if it's written by an eyewitness, it doesn't report anything about the resurrected Jesus. The most numerous and detailed post-resurrection appearances of Jesus are in the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John. Scholarly consensus states this to somewhere between 90 and 100 AD.
What do we make of the lack of the resurrection appearances in Mark? And then the numerous and detailed appearances in John? And then if you like, we can come back to it, but are the Gospels written in the lifetime of eyewitnesses who could have actually fact-checked them?
Mark clearly knows of resurrection appearances of Jesus in Galilee, for he has the angel say to the women at the empty tomb, "Go and tell Peter and his disciples that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him." So, if Mark's gospel does end at chapter 16, verse 8, Mark doesn't care to tell us the story of that appearance, but he knows of such a Galilean appearance. Now, in Matthew's gospel, Matthew does provide such a story of the appearance to the disciples in Galilee. So I'm not really sure what Alex's point here is supposed to be. Mark's gospel provides very early testimony to the facts of Jesus' empty tomb, to an appearance of Jesus to the disciples in Galilee, and to the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. So, what's the problem? I don't think that Alex appreciates how incredibly narrow the window of opportunity is for legend to arise. Consider by contrast, the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch some 400 years after Alexander's death. And yet classical historians still regard these as largely reliable accounts of the life and doings of Alexander. By contrast, in the Gospels, here we have narratives of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection within the first generation after his death. This is far too narrow a window of opportunity for significant accrual of legend in this regard, while eyewitnesses were still alive and the apostles were in control of the testimony of Jesus.
Yeah, that last argument is 100% completely false. And Craig has been told this. He's been presented the evidence that everything he just said is false, but he just keeps repeating the same bogus argument over and over again because he doesn't really care what's true. I have a whole article on this on rapid legendary development that you can find on my blog, where I talk about Craig's attempt to create this supposed evidence that rapid legendary development doesn't happen. All the evidence falls apart. We have tons of examples of rapid legendary development, so none of that matters. The exact opposite is the case of what he's claiming here. It's also really, really annoying to see him use Arian as an example, because Arian does the one thing that the Gospels do not do, which is entirely relevant to Alex's point, which is, Craig acting baffled, like, I don't understand what his point is. His point is this, right? So take Arian as an example. What does Arian do? He says, you know what? I'm going to write this history. I'm only going to rely on 3 sources, books that were written by eyewitnesses. And he explains who the eyewitnesses are and why he's using them. And he comes up with a method. He says, when they disagree, I'll mention it. When they agree, I won't mention it. I'll just report what they say. And so he has this methodology, and sometimes he does that throughout his book. He says, well, one author said this, one author said that. And we even have examples of that with the miracles, like, for instance, the adventure to Siwa in Egypt, where there's a dispute over whether it was a talking horned snake or just a flight of crows. And, you and I can probably guess what the real story is. But Arian mentions, like, it's one or the other, like there's different accounts. And say, well, yeah, the talking snake is bullshit. But the flight of crows, that kind of, happenstance thing could happen. That's the kind of thing going on here. But here, the point is that Arian identifies his sources, identifies that they're eyewitnesses, and so on. The Gospels don't do this at all. And moreover, Arian is writing in the same language as his sources and the people that would be involved in the history of Alexander the Great. The Gospels are not. They're writing in a foreign language in a foreign land. And so this makes a problem with what Sean said earlier, as to how could someone in Corinth, Greece, fact check anything in the Gospels, right? Like they can't afford to travel. They wouldn't even have the skills or knowledge as to how to, like, do a journalistic report on this. So the idea of fact checking is also kind of bogus. I have a whole chapter on this in Not the Impossible Faith, where I talk about, could the facts be checked? The evidence is not really, no. And then we get to the point that they're like Alex was saying, is that these are late sources. Craig and Sean are trying to make that seem like it's not the case, but no, it really is. And as Alex points out, like, we have no evidence. So all the Gospels start to be written in the late 1st century. So basically a whole lifetime later, just like he says. We have no evidence that any witnesses were alive then. We have no evidence that any witnesses even knew about the Gospels, because the Gospels are circulating in a foreign country in foreign language, right? So like people in Galilee, like peasants in Galilee that might have seen Jesus, they don't know any of this, right? So like they're not going to be seeing circulating Greek novels, a century later. But moreover, the Gospels are circulating that we have no evidence. No, more importantly, we have no documents by which to tell what any witnesses were saying. So it's important to note. They say, "Oh, no one gainsaid the Gospels. We have no one fact checking the Gospels." It's like, yeah, we have no one including no one fact checking and confirming they're true. Right? We have no information. So, like, whatever the people were saying in the late first century about these Gospels, we don't know what it is. And so we can't argue from the silence of documents we don't have. So we can't say that no one was saying this was bullshit in the late first century. We actually have evidence in the early second century that people were saying it was bullshit. And we don't get to hear from them. We only get to hear from the critics trying to refute them with forgeries. So an example of this is Second Peter, the letter Second Peter. Second Peter is talking about fellow Christians who are claiming that the Gospels are all just made up myths. And to refute them, he forges an eyewitness testimony, his own testimony to seeing Jesus on the declared God on the mountain or whatever, to prove that the Gospels are literal and not made up myths. Now, this is not Peter. This is some other person in the second century forging a letter, just like Joseph Smith, you might claim, right? Just like the Mormons, faking evidence to argue against fellow Christians who don't think these things really historically happened. They think they're symbolical or whatever. And we have that's not the only evidence. We have other evidence. So we actually have clues to what these people were saying, and it doesn't match what Sean and Craig are claiming. But we don't get to hear from those people, right? This is very important. We don't get to hear what they were saying because those documents weren't preserved. Even if they were written down, like people could be going around saying things, but if talk is idle if it doesn't survive into the next century, right? Like it has to survive in written form for us to even know about it. And so we don't know. We don't know that there were people going around gainsaying these Gospels. And in a sense, the Gospels are gainsaying each other because the exact way that Luke completely changes the nativity of Matthew, Luke is basically arguing with Matthew. He's saying, nope, that's not what happened. I'm going to say what's happened is a completely different thing, right? And then you get this as the appearance stories. You get this, the evolution of the narrative gets more and more wild and ridiculous. It's the same thing. It's like, I don't like that story. I'm going to make up something better, right? And so you get the same. So there were people gainsaying. We just don't get to hear the argument. We just get to see the result of the argument, right? So this idea that it wouldn't be that it would have been fact checked is bogus. This idea that we would hear the gainsaying. No, we wouldn't hear. We don't have any reason to expect we would hear of it, even if there was tons of it. So those things don't really hold up. And I think that's kind of yeah. Okay, so we can take out that little bit there. But one last thing I want to point out with this is they did the thing again that I warned you about before, is that they conflated Paul with the Gospels. And so Alex's point is that Mark doesn't narrate the appearances. So we do not know what Mark thought the appearances were like. This is his point. Now they completely blow past his point and pretend he made some other point. And what they did is, well, no, look at Matthew. He gives us Jesus shows up physically on a mountain or whatever. And then, in the other Gospels, and they touch him and they eat fish with him and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, but that's not in Mark. This is Alex's point, is that those are later embellishments. You're seeing the legend get embellished over time, getting more and more ridiculous over time. But in Mark, he just says he appeared in Galilee. He doesn't say how. Now, we know Mark. We have lots of evidence that Mark is using the letters of Paul to construct his story. So Mark is a Pauline. He's advocating the Pauline sect. So he's in Paul's sect. He's later. He may or may not have known Paul in life. We can't really establish that, but it's possible he did. And he had his letters or some collection of his letters. And so Mark may have thought that the appearance in Galilee, or may have wanted you to believe that the appearances in Galilee were these visions that you had, like the dreams or waking visions that Paul says everybody had, the revelations, right? That in me, not flesh and blood, not a man, a revelation, etc. So that might be what Mark is referring to. And that's Alex's point, is that Mark doesn't say it's not that. We only get the different version, the sort of made up version, after Mark, in reaction to Mark, right? So Matthew doesn't like the fact that Mark didn't do this with the visions. And so Matthew invents a more fabulous appearance narrative. And then Luke doesn't like that. It's too feeble. Like how could some doubt? We can't have that. So Luke then embellishes even more and has all the doubts assuaged, right? It's just, there's some doubted, but then Jesus appears, has them handle him. See, I'm real. So it's a complete made up story. It's just like Second Peter making up an appearance of Jesus to refute these deniers. Luke is doing the same thing. And then, you see John embellishes the Luke story into the Doubting Thomas story, etc. So you're seeing this sort of fabricated evidence getting more and more exaggerated over time. Whereas when you look at Mark, the first gospel, that's not there. None of that stuff is there. So we don't know what kind of visions or appearances Mark imagined. And I think that's Alex's point. And they did not respond to it. They just completely blew past it and tried to, basically bullshit their way out of what Alex said.
Bill, I'm curious if you have a theory or an opinion about why Mark doesn't explicitly include these appearances. And in part for me, it's clear Mark 8, 9, and 10, he predicts his death. He has predictions of his resurrection. And my best guess is that Mark is kind of setting this up, saying, now what are you going to do about it? We've made it clear who Jesus is. Now anticipating his appearance, which by the time Mark was written, everybody would have known the story itself. It's almost like a challenge to the readers. What are you going to do with this pending appearance claim that's coming? Do you have an opinion on that at all?
I don't have a strong opinion because it is so perplexing that the story just breaks off after verse 8. But I think what you've suggested is not implausible. And it does leave the reader confronted with the question of how he's going to respond to this. But the key point, I think, is the one that you just made, namely, for Mark's readership and audience, they know what he's talking about. This is written ex post facto. So it shows that Mark knows there was at least one Galilean appearance of Jesus, such as Matthew relates. And so you have evidence in the Gospel of Mark for the honorable burial, the discovery of the empty tomb, a resurrection appearance to the disciples, and the origin of the disciples' faith. That's the heart of the case for the resurrection of Jesus.
So the question is why, which he didn't answer, is why did Mark not narrate the appearances? He then sort of like apologizes for Mark not doing it and makes up stories as to what's going on. But the most obvious reason that Mark doesn't narrate the appearances is that Mark is too close to the origin of the religion. In his time when he's writing, to narrate the appearances of the Lord in a revelation is too sacred and too holy a thing to write down, right? Like that's a personal, private experience. That's why Paul never narrates it, right? He just refers to it. He says, Jesus appeared to me. He describes it as a revelation. Jesus spoke to me and he said this, right? He doesn't give narrative details of what the experience is like because that's too sacred, too holy. If you related it at all, you would relate it in secret to, sufficiently ranked initiates or whatever. It's not something you would write down. And this is very common in all mystery religions, this idea that there's certain experiences involved in the mysteries that you do not write down, that they're only for you and for fellow initiates, right? And we have that in a lot of different texts and writing about how the mystery religions considered certain things too sacred to narrate on paper. And that would be the same, or papyrus, vellum, whatever. That would be the same for Mark, right? The idea of narrating the appearances. Now, Matthew has enough distance. He's writing it so much later. He has enough distance that idea of these secretly narrated stories are no longer so sacred or holy. In fact, they might not even exist anymore. The narrative, the oral lore may have dissipated by then, so that no one really had a clear connection anymore to what those narratives were. The only evidence we have of possibly a narrative surviving is in Acts, where Paul sees Jesus as a blinding light and a voice in his head. And that actually tracks what we know of other visions in other religions. So that actually could go back to an original sacred story. But Matthew doesn't want that. Matthew wants, the risen Jesus to show up on a mountain because he wants this sort of scriptural Moses handing on the new commission from his own mountain, etc. So that's, I think, the most logical reason that Mark doesn't do it is it's too sacred for him to do that, because what he's doing is at the end, by having that, he's going to appear to Peter and the apostles, right, and the disciples. By having that line, he's telling the reader what the reader will know. Craig is right. Like his readers already know some things. All we're debating is what it is that those readers know, right? And so, what do the readers know? The readers know that the creed. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul goes through the creed, and then Jesus rose from the dead, and then he appeared to Peter, then he appeared to the 12, etc. They know that. And so Mark is referencing that. So they know. Then now you go to 1 Corinthians 15 and you read from there, and that's all you need. That's as far as Mark and his audience is concerned, that's all you need. You don't need a narrative of you don't need these nitty-gritty details of the visions. You just need to know that he appeared. It was confirmed by apostolic, witness, etc. And so that's what Mark is thinking. And therefore it's entirely compatible. In fact, makes more sense that Mark is referring to what Paul was referring to, which is these inner visions, not a body walking around. Right. So that's again, overturns their assumption that we can just assume later gospels, the embellished versions of the legends, are identical to the earliest versions of the story that Mark is alluding to, which is obviously not the case, right? Let's see. So there's that. The only other thing I'll add to that is that I don't think contrary to what Dr. Craig says, like he just assumes because Mark says the appearances are in Galilee, that counts as evidence confirming that the first appearances were in Galilee. Now that's contradicted by Luke and John, who both say the appearances occurred in Jerusalem, not in Galilee. So you have a problem there. But I think the Galilee location is as made up as the Jerusalem location. I think the Jerusalem location of Mark or of Luke and John, they made that up because they needed the appearances to be in the holy city of God, and it's a narrative reason that they wanted to be there and elide the role of Galilee. Mark and Matthew put it in Galilee for the reason that Scripture said so. And so in Isaiah 9, it is said that the gospel will come out of Galilee. So Mark designs his entire narrative around Galilean mission to reify Scripture, just as Paul said you're supposed to do, that you're supposed to get the truth out of Scripture. And Matthew just uses Mark's model and keeps the visions there to sort of complete Mark in the way that he wanted to complete it. So this idea of putting it in Galilee comes from Scripture, and I don't think it relates to a historical fact. I don't think it necessarily shows that it occurred in Galilee. Mark is just referencing back to Galilee to reference back to the way he's put his whole mission, his whole story in Galilee, to convey something about what the Scripture said. So I don't think we can be confident that Mark actually thought the appearances first occurred in Galilee. There's literary and scriptural reasons for him to invent that detail. But the rest, I think he's clearly referring to the visions that Paul is talking about. He's not referring to future made-up stories of a physical corpse Jesus.
How significant is the dating of the Gospels for your case for the resurrection? Is it important that we get like Mark in the 40s or 50s, as some maybe try to mark you? If it was in the 70s, would it really not affect kind of the core case that you're making for the resurrection?
No, it doesn't. You notice this the way I stated it just now. I said that these narratives go back to within the first generation after the events, which is extraordinary for ancient history. So we can accept that Mark was written around AD 70, Luke, Acts around 70 to 80, Matthew around AD 80. That still is within that narrow time frame that I described. Now, personally, though, Sean, I find the arguments that the book of Acts was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 to be almost compelling.
Oh, wow.
It's to me that the conspiration of independent lines of evidence, all pointing to Acts, having been written before AD 70, is very powerful. And since Luke was written prior to Acts, that would mean that Luke was written then prior to AD 70. And if Luke used Mark, then Mark was written even earlier. And so I think this does push the dates back even further to narrow that window of opportunity for legendary development to an even more impossible narrowness.
That, of course, is completely bogus. There is no good evidence that Acts was written before the Jewish War. In fact, all the evidence points to it being written after. There's a lot of specious apologetics to try and trump up things as evidence that aren't really evidence of this point. And that gets into a whole rabbit hole of that whole apologetic, in which hundreds of pages could be written. And I have a blog on my, or an article on my blog on why Acts is a fake history. And you can get started there as to why this attempt to sort of predate Acts doesn't work at all. There's a lot of reasons why that's the case. I mean, Paul has no knowledge. First Clement has no knowledge. Hebrews has no knowledge of any of the peculiar contents of the gospel. So clearly they weren't circulating at the time, right? So, and that's the main reason. But there's like tons of other reasons why we can show that Mark is definitely aware of the Jewish war and writing in response to it. Even more than just Mark 13. It's not just the apocalypse. It's also the fig tree narrative and there's other things in Mark that are clearly referencing the destruction of Jerusalem as a thing that's already happened and that needs to be explained. So Mark is essentially an apologetic for the war. So he has to be post-war. Luke embellishes even more. Luke is using material from the Antiquities of Josephus, which were written in the 90s. So Luke can't be written before the 90s, and so on and so forth. You can go down the line as you go down, figuring out the dates of the gospel. So the traditional dates of the gospels are far more plausible than any of this. And the idea that it doesn't matter is also bogus. It does matter. When you see, I like how Craig says these were written really near. It was the 70s is the first generation after these things happened, which is kind of a really specious way to say the second generation, right? First generation after is called the second generation. They're written in the second generation. So the first generation is past, and now we have the second generation of Christians, and now we get these books. And the timeline of about 40 years is very typical. In fact, for these kinds of wild legends, the sort of timeline, 40 years is very common. So you look at the cargo cult. This starts with a bunch of shamans hearing messages in telegraph poles. Within 40 years, John Frum is this whole messiah who's come to the island, and there's a whole biography of John Frum coming to the island and delivering the messages. 40 years is all it took. And so it's within that ballpark, 30 to 40 years. The Roswell flying saucer, that whole made up narrative, which got all the way embellished to the point of alien autopsies for about 40 years, right? So you can find example after example after example that 40 years is about how long it takes for these things to get ridiculous. And that's exactly when the Gospels start to be written, right? So that is a problem. If we could prove that the Gospel of Mark, say, was written in the year 4, or 4 years after, if it was written 4 years after, not 40, then you would have a pretty good case that it was, it could be embellished, it could be exaggerating stuff, but there's got to be a historical core in that case. So it would be impossible for Mark to pull that off without other people commenting on him making it up, and Paul having had to react to the people, this argument between, is Mark telling the truth? Is it not? It would all be entangled in Paul's letters, but that's clearly not happened. And so I think it is true that it would matter if the Gospels are written closer to the events. I think that would make them more plausible. It wouldn't guarantee every single thing they said was true exactly as written, but it would make them more plausible as history. But that's not the case. So we can't argue from premises that are false or that we can't establish. So that's a dead end as an argument.
One quick point in this, I think Wes Huff's general point is that these are not events that were done just kind of out of the public eye, but these are public events that people could engage and know. And especially if you're right on the dating of Acts. Peter says in Acts 2:22, men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. That is such an interesting claim that Peter preaches this to his audience. They know it because this wasn't done in private, but done in public. I think that's the root of what Wes is getting at, which in many ways sets Christianity apart from other faiths.
Yeah, notice none of those things done in public is anything to do with the resurrection. So now they're conflating historicity with the resurrection. And I'm sure Alex is probably a historicist. I imagine Alex assumes that there's a historical Jesus. It's entirely plausible that there's a historical Jesus. And it's entirely plausible that Peter gave a speech about all the things Jesus did in public that was seen publicly, which is not, in fact, any of his impressive miracles, but all his standard stuff that any huckster can perform. So, yeah, that's entirely plausible, but that doesn't tell us anything about Jesus rising from the dead or confirming his resurrection from the dead. And so there's just that kind of trick there. I have a whole chapter on this trick because this is an old one in my book, Not the Impossible Faith, which is about this concept. And the idea of, I have a whole section on Acts 2 and Peter's speech and all of that. If people want to look into, if you really look at the speech, it doesn't really tell us anything useful about it. And also it's just riffing on the gospel. So Luke is just inventing a speech for Peter that just relates what Luke had just invented in the gospel. None of this tells us anything about whether Peter ever gave this speech or whether he used exactly those words when he did or what he spoke, etc. So they're acting like Acts 2 is some sort of eyewitness transcript of something that actually happened, but no, it's not. It's a made-up story invented by the author of Luke, just riffing on his gospel. So that doesn't really give us any useful information of the kind that they're trying to allege here.
There are dozens of non-canonical gospels that were written but didn't make it into the New Testament for all kinds of different reasons. Listen to what Wes Huff has to say about these gospels.
And so these books that were not included, are any of them interesting? I mean,
They're all interesting.
But does any of it seem like it belongs in the New Testament?
Well, so part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books. So you do have, and some of them have an agenda to them.
Like, what? I'm just going to underline that. He just said of the non-canonical gospels.
Part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books.
The problem here is with basically the first thing that anybody learns about the New Testament. Scholars think that Mark was written first, then Matthew and Luke were written later. Why? Because Matthew and Luke are reliant on Mark. And not just a little bit. More than 90% of Mark's gospel is also in Matthew's gospel. Mark has 660 verses in total. Over 600 of them are also in Matthew, often copied verbatim. It is undisputed that there is a literary dependence between Matthew and Luke and Mark.
Again, there's a lot here, Bill, but here's the question I'd love for you to weigh in on. Is Wes right that we can dismiss the Gnostic Gospels for having an agenda and for being reliant upon earlier Gospels? What should we make of the Gnostic Gospels?
Here, I think that Alex is needlessly unsympathetic to what Wes Huff was saying. The apocryphal Gospels, things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, and so on, do not appear until the second half of the 2nd century after Christ. And they are shaped by the pagan philosophy of Gnosticism. They do not evince a genuine historical interest in Jesus of Nazareth. Rather, Jesus simply serves as a kind of sock puppet, a mouthpiece for spouting Gnostic doctrine. What historical nuggets the apocryphal Gospels do contain all come from the New Testament, which they know. So the apocryphal Gospels are not useful as sources for the life and teachings of Jesus. Now, again, I want to ask, what is Alex's point supposed to be? Surely he doesn't think that the apocryphal Gospels are reliable sources. Rather, he must think that Wes Huff's critique is correct, but that it would also invalidate the New Testament Gospels. But that inference, I think, is far too quick. Of course, the New Testament Gospels have an agenda. And of course, there are relations of dependency between them. Nevertheless, they do provide early, multiple, independent attestation to many aspects of the life of Jesus, and therefore are generally regarded as valuable historical sources for the life of Christ. To give just one illustration, take the burial narrative of Jesus, such an important event, the burial in the tomb. This is attested in the pre-Markan Passion story that Mark used in writing his gospel. It is also to be found in Matthew's special source material, that is to say, material that Matthew had that he did not derive from Mark, And it's also found in Luke's special material, that is material unique to Luke, which he did not derive from Mark or from Matthew. And then the story is also found in the Gospel of John, which is generally regarded as independent of the three synoptics. Go over to the Apostle Paul, and you find the burial mentioned in the very old tradition handed down by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. And on top of all that, the burial account is mentioned in the apostolic sermons in the Acts of the Apostles. So look what we've got here. You've got 5 or 6 independent sources for the burial account, some of which are among the most ancient, earliest materials in the New Testament. And so these are incomparably better sources than the second century apocryphal gospel.
Wes Huff was on with Joe Rogan 3 hours, and Joe is admittedly not an expert in these things. And Wes is trying to popularize certain points and wasn't able to expand. So it sounded like Wes was just saying, I dismiss the Gospels because they have an agenda and they're reliant upon earlier texts. And if that's what he was saying, then Alex fairly said, wait a minute, the Gospels also have an agenda. And Matthew and Luke, for example, are reliant upon an earlier text. So I think Alex fairly said, I'm not totally sure if I'm capturing what Wes communicates here. So I literally texted Wes to make sure I was understanding what his point was. And he clarified to me that he means the Gnostic Gospels are reliant upon established canonical Gospels. But rather than bringing the same message as, for example, Matthew and Luke do with Mark, they have a Gnostic agenda of incorporating their own pagan beliefs onto the earlier texts. So the agenda of the Gospels is to proclaim who Jesus is, and the agenda of the Gnostic Gospels is to appropriate Jesus for their own theological, philosophical perspective, which was foreign to the first century Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. So I think that clarification really helps. And Wes's argument, if he's able to expand it, still stands.
Yeah, literally everything there was false. My gosh. First of all, the idea that a Gnostic agenda is somehow less historically reliable than any other agenda doesn't make any sense. Like, Alex's point is that if there's an agenda and they're using Jesus as a mouthpiece for their agenda, then the reason for rejecting the non-canonicals is exactly the same reason that you should then reject the canonicals, right? Like, saying that, so what they're implying there is that this Gnostic agenda didn't exist in the first century, but there's actually no evidence of that being the case. In fact, anything that you would think of as Gnostic, we can find examples of in early first century stuff. Like, we could find Gnostic material in the letters of Paul. We can find it in First Clement. We can find it in Hebrews. We can find it in the canonical Gospels have elements of this. And I think part of this is a word game where the word Gnostic is being used to mean one thing at the beginning of your argument, and then it becomes a different thing halfway through. So that they're trying to like hyper define Gnostic, and then they're going to loosely define Gnostic. And so they're playing word games with the word Gnostic. Gnostic is a bad word anyway. The Gnosticism as a concept didn't exist. This is a whole new point that, the Westar Institute and other scholars have come out saying, look, the whole construct of Gnosticism is a bad idea of 20th century scholarship, and we should abandon it. And that's important because it means that there was, and there's a reason they came to this conclusion, is that there is no such thing as a Gnostic agenda. There are many agendas, and those agendas overlap and are similar or different from each other in a lot of different ways. And you can find elements of Gnostic agendas in the canonical Gospels. You can find elements of different agendas in Paul's letters and so on. So that's not a useful way to date the material. You have to go gospel by gospel. If you look, for example, the Gospel of Peter, which does seem very clearly based on, Matthew and Mark, there's nothing particularly Gnostic about it, right? Like, there's nothing that they could be complaining about that looks second century. The most you could say about it is that it has its own agenda, and it is reacting to and using as the sources Matthew and Mark. Yeah, that's exactly what Luke did, right? So like it's hard to say what are you talking about here? And this is also why we can't really date these things. Craig says, well, they date late second century. That's an inaccuracy. He's probably deliberately confusing or conflating. We only have references to them in the late second century. with the conclusion that that's when they begin. But the problem is we have no early second century texts that discuss the circulating gospels, or very little, almost none. And so we don't know. We actually, and we have none for the late first century. So we don't know when these gospels actually arose. We cannot say that they first arose in the late second century. The most you can say is like the Gospel of Peter has to postdate Matthew and Mark, like that. Like you can say that confidently because he's clearly building on material from those gospels, so they had to be written first. But that's as best we can get. Now, this does mean we can't say they're early either, but it does also mean we can't say they're late, and therefore we can't use their being late as an argument against them. There are some gospels that we can show are too late to be useful, but there's a lot of these non-canonicals that we can't say that about. We also don't have all of these, by the way. There's some 40 gospels that existed that we know about, but we only have fragments of most of those, or fragments of some of those, and I don't think we have a complete example of any of them. The Gospel of Peter, we only have a fragment of. And so, okay, so then we get to this idea of the pre-Mark and Passion narrative. That's a thing that William Lane Craig has completely made up. There's no evidence of a pre-Mark and Passion narrative. What he means is what the rest of us call Luke copied ideas and changed ideas from Matthew and Mark, and Matthew used ideas and copied ideas from Mark, and John was aware of the synoptics and riffed on them in his construction of the story. And that's it. There's no evidence of an earlier version of the story. It all seems to go back to Mark. There's no evidence of any version of the story prior to Mark. So that whole pre-Mark and Passion narrative thing is fake. There's no evidence for it. And then finally, this idea that we have independent sources. So Craig somehow uses this pre-Mark and Passion narrative to spin out 6 independent sources. I don't even understand the logic here. I know they claim this constantly, but it's playing fast and loose with the word independent means. Even if there was a pre-Mark and Passion narrative, that's one source, right? So that means Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John are not independent sources. They are all reliant on one source, the pre-Mark and Passion narrative. That's one source, not 6. Moreover, we don't have that source. It's made up, so there's no evidence for that source anyway. It's all Mark, really. It all goes back to Mark. Mark's the first one, and everything else is an embellishment on Mark or an embellishment on embellishments on Mark, and that's the whole story for all of those. John is not independent of the synoptic. Luke is not independent of Matthew and Mark. Matthew is not independent of anybody else, independent of Mark. So there is no independent sources here at all. And I think there's this sort of a tendency to assume, conveniently, that anything that Matthew changes or adds must have a source and therefore be independent. But that's not how it worked, right? Like, so we have no evidence that Matthew didn't just make it all up, right? Like, so we have no evidence that Matthew had a source, right? He could have just embellished. He could have just added things, right? Like that's it. There's no evidence. And you could say, well, you can't prove there's no sources. Yeah, but that's not the point. The point is that you can't prove there is one. And that's why you cannot say we have an independent source. We do not know this. We do not have any knowledge that would pertain to any independent sources at all. There's only one source, Mark, and embellishers on Mark. And that's all we have, right? And so the idea that non-canonical gospels keep doing that. And we have examples, for instance, the Egerton gospel, which clearly is some sort of riff or possibly earlier version than our gospel John, because it overlaps with John, but is a little different. And we know our John is a multiply redacted version. So you look at any Johannine expert today, they'll tell you it's been produced in 2, possibly 3 editions, and we don't have the original editions. We only have a late redacted copy, which removed things, added things, moved things around, and changed things. So the Egerton gospel could be an earlier version of our gospel John that got changed and edited into our version. So that's a gospel that could actually date to the same time as our gospels, and so on. So you could go from non-canonical to non-canonical. Some of them could plausibly be late 1st century, early 2nd century. Some of them are late, and therefore we can dismiss them. Some of them are doing what they said, where they just have Jesus make long speeches. But some of them are narratives, just like the gospels we have, like the Gospel of Peter and the Egerton gospel. And so the non-canonicals are very diverse in what they talk about and what their agendas are and so on. And so you can't make these blanket statements that they're saying about it. But I think it still holds up that what Alex said is still true, and Sean did not recover it, because when Sean says he asked Huff, and Huff says, well, no, I think we can rule out the non-canonicals because of their Gnostic agenda. but because the canonicals have an agenda, we can't rule them out. Alex is right that that's an illogical demarcation. If you think having an agenda and relying on other sources to build out your case is a reason to dismiss the non-canonicals, then that reason holds equally for the canonicals. You got to dismiss them as well. This apologetic that Sean spun, that Huff spun, that Sean is repeating, is completely illogical. It is not capable of achieving the goal. I think it's a backpedal. It's an attempt to try and rescue himself from saying something that he realized after the fact is bad. It looks bad. And it does reveal the truth, is that the only reason they reject the non-canonicals is they don't like them. Right? They don't agree with their agenda, and that's the only reason they don't like them. Now, I personally think like most of the non-canonicals are post-canonical. Some of them, like I said, could overlap, like Egerton and Gospel of Peter, but we can't nail down when they were written. So I do think I dismiss the non-canonicals simply because, insofar as we can use them at all, they're so derivative of the Gospels we already have that they add nothing, right? So we can't do anything with the Gospel of Peter. We can't do anything with the Gospel of Egerton. They're clearly just making stuff up. So even if they were written in the same time as the canonical Gospels, that isn't useful information for us at all. And so if we look at the canonical Gospels, I think we're getting some of the examples, basically a good example of what's going on in the late 1st century, early 2nd century in terms of composing Gospels. I don't think we need the non-canonicals to make any particular point. And we can't establish they're early any more than we can establish they're late, so that makes them difficult. Whereas we know the canonicals are earlier than most of the non-canonicals, because of the reliance. But anyway, I'm rambling. The point being is that you can't get Huff's argument out of this. You have to pick a lane. You either have to say, okay, I'm going to trust things with an agenda that are reliant on other Gospels, or not. And then you have to face the consequences of which lane you've picked to drive in. Neither one works out well for Huff.
How
So,
do you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
well,
How many people saw his body, right?
Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion.
No, saw the resurrected
resurrection.
Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
Wes gets this slightly wrong, as Paul actually says that Jesus appeared to 500, not 400 people at one time. But this only makes it all the more amazing. 500 people witnessing the physically resurrected Jesus would be an amazing proof of his resurrection. Unfortunately, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the only mention we have of this event anywhere. It's not in the Gospels, nor in Acts, nor in any other historical source. So, what do we learn about this event from 1 Corinthians? Nothing. Nothing at all. Paul does write that, quote, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, but that's it. We're not told who these people are, or why they were gathered, or when this occurred, or how Paul learned about it, or how he knows the number of people involved. Paul himself wasn't there. Is this just something that he heard about? From whom? When? We're not told anything about this extraordinary event.
There's a lot here again, Bill, but the heart of the question is I'm really curious your take on how valuable, central, and reliable is the appearance to the 500 as cited by Paul in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed.
Certainly, it would be very nice to have multiple attestation of this appearance, but it would be a misuse of the criteria of authenticity to say that because the appearance is not multiply attested, therefore it is unhistorical. The criteria of authenticity, like multiple attestation, dissimilarity, and so forth, can only be used positively to increase the probability of some event. But obviously, being singly attested does not imply that the event, therefore, did not occur. In fact, I think that we have really good grounds for thinking that the appearance to the 500 brethren did occur, because Paul goes on to say of the 500 brethren, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. That shows that this appearance was not just a meaningless cipher for Paul. Rather, he knew the people involved, and he was aware that some of them had passed away in the interim. Paul's mentioning that some of them are still alive can only mean the witnesses are there to be questioned. Now, why don't we have then an appearance or a story of this appearance? Well, think about it with me. An appearance to 500 people at one time would have to take place out of doors. Uh, for example, perhaps on a Galilean hillside where thousands of people had gathered to hear Jesus preach during his lifetime. The Gospels tend to focus their attention on the resurrection appearances in Jerusalem as opposed to Galilee. But a provocative suggestion is that the mountaintop appearance in Galilee, narrated by Matthew, could be the appearance to the 500 brethren. One of the interesting things about Matthew's appearance story is that unlike all the other appearances, which were unexpected and caught people by surprise, is that this one was by appointment. Matthew says the disciples went to the mountain which Jesus had appointed them to go to, and there he appeared to them. And it was, of course, in Galilee that thousands of people had thronged to hear Jesus. I think it's not at all improbable that 500 people might have gathered with the disciples on that mountaintop to wait for Jesus and to experience this appearance. And so it could be that we do actually have a mention of this appearance story in the Galilean appearance story in Matthew.
As a whole, my take is there's multiple appearance accounts. We have different accounts to the women. We have account to the two disciples in Luke 24, the Emmaus disciples. We have multiple accounts to the disciples with Thomas, without Thomas, James, Paul, etc. And we have the 500. So it's a piece of a cumulative case, and we can make, I think Alex goes too far in saying, what do we learn from this event? Nothing at all. I think that's too skeptical. I don't think Wes, I think he was just simply citing this as, hey, do we have appearances of Jesus? Here's one example. Would have given others. So we can be too critical, but we can also be too confident in it. To me, it's a piece of a larger case that just strengthens the appearances of Jesus.
Yeah, so they're playing word games again. When Alex said we learn nothing at all about this, he did not mean that we don't even learn that this story was going around, right? Like what he means is we don't know what it was. Like what was the experience? And I know, I happen to know that Alex goes on to make this point that it could have been a vision of a celestial, like a light in the sky or something like that, which would track with the way mass visions work in history, like so through religions and other things. The mass visions of the Virgin Mary or her miracles track this, right? Like this idea that it's a light or some sort of phenomenon in the sky, that everybody convinces themselves that they're seeing something fantastical that proves the presence of whatever entity. And there are other examples of this that you can cite outside the traditions of Christianity. But that's Alex's point, is that Paul doesn't say what it was. He says, yeah, it appears to more than 500, but how? Appeared where? Appeared in what way? What scientifically did that refer to? So I don't think Alex briefly mentions that he doesn't know, or that we don't know where the story came from, how Paul knows it's true, etc. But I think Alex's point overall is not that it didn't happen, but that the details are not there, so we can't do anything with this. Like, it doesn't tell us anything useful. I think there's a little bit more we can learn about it, specifically because of the specific words that are used. For example, in that verse, Paul says that appearance happened all at once, which means conspicuously the others did not. So when Paul says Jesus, the risen, the revelatory Jesus appeared to Peter and then the 12, he does not say the 12 all at once. So therefore, those were individual spiritual experiences. They were not a mass. It was not all 12 together experiencing Jesus. It was the 12 each had their own experiences, came together and said, yes, we had these experiences. And then the only experience that Paul relates that is an appearance all at once to a bunch of people, the number of people, I mean, the number could be exaggerated, it doesn't matter. That Paul clearly understands this to have been a vision to multiple people. He clearly understands some of them to still be alive and some to be dead, etc. Um, and so that's probably true. Like this, like I doubt this is a made up story. I don't think Paul's making it up. I think it probably goes back to something that really happened. But Paul is saying that's the only event that happened all at once. So it's the only mass appearance that occurred. And again, like Alex says, Paul never says what it is. And I have a whole article that goes into this in detail called and then he appeared to more than 500 brethren. You can go to my blog, richardcarrier.info, look for that article, and you can read me go through all of this, the science behind it, the grammar behind it, and all of this stuff. I think it's when they say when we're trying to interpret what Paul means, we have to interpret Paul in relation to Paul. We can't jump into the future generations later and look at wild stories and assume that's what Paul's referring to. This goes back to the point I was making earlier. We can't do that. No, we have to interpret Paul in light of what Paul says. And what does Paul tell us? He tells us that the gospel is known through scripture and revelation. There's no ministry of Jesus you get a revelation. You are appointed by an apostle, or as an apostle, by a revelation. This is in Galatians 1, as you have a revelation. So Paul doesn't seem, and he even says, like the idea of appeared to, like the context is revelations, individual appearances, fleeting appearances. They're not lasting, ongoing appearances. They're sudden one-offs that these people have. So we're talking about revelations. So Paul, if you want to understand what Paul means, he means some sort of revelatory event. Now, with the mass occasion, there's different ways that can manifest. And when Sean and Craig try to push this into Matthew 28, that doesn't work because Matthew specifically says that only the 11 are there. And also the 11, Paul says 12. So Matthew's rewriting the story already. But the idea that there could have been other people there is not a useful argument because that's not a fact, right? You can't build on a premise of something that isn't attested, right? So you can't say, well, I guess there are a bunch of people there, therefore that's the same event. No, it's the appearance to the 12. Matthew is narrating the appearance to the 12. He's subtracted one because he killed one off in his story. But it's clear that it's just the 11, right? And yet he acknowledges some of them didn't believe it, which is sort of an acknowledgement this is a revelatory event. Maybe those guys had to be persuaded to come around that it was really an appearance of the Lord, etc. But there's clearly an acknowledgement of some fact that this was not a very clear demonstration of the resurrection of Jesus. There's something questionable about it. And so that gets to the, Matthew depicts it as Jesus showing up bodily there. But that's Matthew's, embellishment. That's his legendary development. When we look at, like Paul and stuff, it probably wasn't that. It was probably something much more ambiguous, a much more ambiguous experience. A much more plausible attribution of what Paul is referring to is what occurs in Acts 2, which is the Pentecost appearance to the brethren, more than 100 brethren in Acts, where they see flaming tongues, they feel the Holy Spirit, and they hear a voice, etc. That is probably closer and may even in fact derive from this verse in Mark or in Paul, because Paul's verse, it's interesting. There's a lot of verbiage in Acts 2 about this that is very close to the verbiage of this verse in Paul that we're talking about, to the point that it is entirely possible that our version of the verse is corrupted, that originally it didn't say more than 500 brethren, that originally it said to the brethren on the Pentecost. And Paul in the same chapter refers to the Pentecost, where he says Jesus is the first fruits of the general resurrection, which is connecting Jesus with the Pentecost, with the idea of first fruits. And Acts has, appears to the brethren all at once on the Pentecost. The Greek words for Pentecost and 500 are very, very close. In fact, it's easy for a mistake to lead an emendation from one to the other. So I think it's entirely plausible that Luke, and you have to explain, why do none of the other gospel authors, not even Luke in Acts, why did none of them have never heard of this appearance to 500, to more than 500? Why do they all have access to Paul's letters? Why did none of them, this is juicy. Why would they leave it out, right? This is the best thing they could include. Why would they leave it on the cutting room floor? And I think one explanation that would explain this is that it did not exist in Paul's letters when they were reading Paul's letters. When they were reading Paul's letters, it talked about a Pentecost appearance, which wouldn't fit for Mark, Matthew, or Luke's gospel because they're narrating the events up to, the third day. They're not going on 50 days later. But Luke does when he gets in Acts. In volume 2 of, his gospel is Acts. He goes 50 days further. And so he does narrate this appearance to more than 500 or more than 100 brethren. I think the number didn't exist. I think Paul might have said to all the brethren at Pentecost, and that Luke is narrating that by embellishing it into this tongues, the flaming tongues experience, and the feeling the Holy Spirit, and the presence of the Lord becomes an appearance of the Lord. Now I can't prove that, right? Like we don't have any decisive way to prove that, but that is a more plausible possibility than this trying to rewrite Matthew 28 to turn it into an appearance to more than 500, which is not at all what Matthew clearly had in mind. And I talk about this, the language, how the Greek is so close between the two verses, Acts 2 and 1 Corinthians 15, and this one verse, in that article on the appearance to more than 500.
Just one comment to get your thoughts on. I did a recent video where I'm mentioning some of these interesting parallels in response to inspiring philosophy, the apologists, who want to deny that Dionysus was said in myth and lore and festivities of transforming water into wine. And I was reading not only Dennis McDonald's work, Mark W.G. Steib, other academics who are finding the Johannine gospel to imitate Euripides in some way, and it's a tragedian type gospel. There seems to be tragedy elements, and there seems to be general parallels that seem to be there. Mark W.G. Steib likes to indicate maybe they're there, but here's some general ones. Dr. McDonald in his book, The Dionysian Gospel, says he gets cold feet and runs away from going all the way. Let me take you all the way, right? And he goes into everything from like John 4 with the Samaritan woman who's being promiscuous. Well, the Maenads are accused by Pentheus of being promiscuous in the wilderness out there in their own frenzy. Anyway, I don't want to get lost in the details, just to simply highlight the Acts 2 situation with the fires, the tongue of fire, and they go into a frenzy. And I thought, wow, in Euripides, you see them being accused of being drunk when they're in a frenzy, just like it's early morning. And Peter goes, look, they're not drunk.
Yeah, and that's in Acts, right? That's in Acts 2, the accusation of them being drunk. Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, I just didn't know if you thought that maybe what your personal insight, if you thought you were persuaded that maybe there was something going on there, as far as.
I mean, there are other scholars who've gone into the analysis of this. I think Dennis McDonald and others have explored it. But just on a more basic level, rather than making any more concrete claims, it is absolutely the case that readers of Luke would know the Bacchic context, right? Like the absolute, it would not be an obscure text to them. So they would immediately recognize the allusion, right? Like there's no doubt, right? And Luke, as he's writing it, would know that people would get the allusion. And so that he's basically embellishing and riffing on an existing mythology within paganism. So there's no doubt that that's the case. What you make of that is, that's a whole separate basket of eggs or whatever. But yeah. So the idea, I think, to go back to what Alex is saying is that this verse doesn't tell us anything that we need to know. And notice that Sean and Craig, or Dr. Craig, are doing this thing again where they're just conflating the Gospels with Paul. So saying like, well, if Paul said there's an appearance to more than 500, then Luke 24, where Jesus is visiting them and having dinner with them and stuff, must be true. It's like, but no, that's not what Paul says. And that's Alex's point, is that Paul does not say that, right? That is an embellished legend that is a made-up story later on. Paul conspicuously doesn't say that. So he doesn't tell us that it was that kind of experience at all. And if we look at what Paul does seem to think these experiences were like, they're inner visions, they're spiritual encounters, they're not bodily encounters. And so that's, even insofar as Paul thought Jesus had a body, the experience itself for him is like an experience in a dream, or an experience in the sky, or an experience, in a revelation. Like it's some sort of spiritual experience. It's not an ordinary, I had dinner with the guy, right? Like that's the thing. And so that Paul doesn't have any idea of it being any different from anybody else. The idea that it's different for anybody else was invented by the Gospels later, and not even the first Gospel, as Alex pointed out originally. Matthew's the first to even hint at a bodily and like a physical Jesus like shows up and they can see him as a person. But even then he says some doubted. So clearly Jesus doesn't look like himself. He looks like something else. So it's some sort of like visionary experience. Luke starts to like fix this problem by making it damn sure that no, he freaking came and he had dinner with these guys and they touched him. It was definitely a body. It wasn't a vision. It wasn't a phantom. It wasn't a dream. And then John runs with that to come up with even more elaborate ways to make the point. But by the time we're at Luke doing this, it's obvious that they're reacting to the tradition no longer satisfying them, right? They have to invent these details to fix the fact that the original story is not this. The original story is more wishy-washy. It's more of like the sort of visionary, dreamy kind of experience. And they don't like that. They have to get rid of that because that looks bad. They need a better, more concrete way of presenting it. So they have these apologetics that they invented. And that's why these apologetics don't exist in Matthew. That's why we don't see them in Mark. We don't see reactions to them in either because they didn't exist yet. So these stories that we see in Luke and John are late stories. They didn't exist when Matthew and Mark were writing. And they certainly didn't exist when Paul was writing.
And even if the 500 people did all believe it was Jesus, how many of them were already predisposed to think this? Remember, sometimes groups do claim to see visions, such as various apparitions of Mary or the Roman Emperor Constantine's vision of a cross of light in the sky, which may have been seen by his whole army as well. The source isn't clear. Look at this image. This is a picture of a crowd in Fatima, Portugal in 1917. This crowd, many more than 500 in number, were witness to the so-called miracle of the sun. A prophecy by 3 shepherd children said that the Virgin Mary would perform a miracle on the 13th of October, causing this large crowd to gather on that day. And the miracle happened. Testimonies from the members in the crowd were published in the newspaper. They claimed to have seen the sun dancing in the sky, zigzagging around, and even advancing towards the earth, all for 10 minutes. So a large crowd witnessing a prophesied miracle, and we actually know who saw it and precisely what they saw. We even have their direct testimony. Does Wes Huff believe in this Catholic miracle? Do you? And if not, why not?
So I'm really curious your take. How do we respond to group visions of the Virgin Mary?
I think here Alex is drawing our attention to a very important point, namely the antecedent beliefs of persons which would dispose those persons towards certain experiences. Like Alex, I am skeptical of the Marian mass appearances. The person who experiences Marian visions are typically Roman Catholics predisposed toward belief in the Virgin Mary. And so for exactly the same reason, I wouldn't lay too much emphasis on the appearance to the 500 brethren, who were probably all Christians. It's interesting that Paul refers to them as brethren, 500 brethren. So these people were probably already Christian believers, and therefore predisposed to believe in Jesus' resurrection. And so I wouldn't lay too much emphasis on this. As you said, Sean, it's a piece in the puzzle. It's part of the cumulative case. I think the really important appearances are the appearances to Peter and to the 12. These early appearances were completely contrary to antecedent Jewish beliefs, which predisposed them not to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. One of the most remarkable things about the belief in the resurrection of Jesus is that the earliest disciples who suddenly and sincerely came to this belief were predisposed by their first century typical Jewish thought forms completely against it. And so this is one of the major factors crying out for explanation with respect to the resurrection of Jesus. What N.T. Wright has called these mutations in Jewish belief about the resurrection that were necessitated by believing in Jesus rising from the dead. This is not a natural evolution of antecedent Judaism.
Now, if I understand Alex's reasoning correctly, he's saying, if we have this appearance of the 500, then we would need to adopt these Catholic visions of Mary. And since many people don't accept those, we should question the 500. I would say, well, all right, if we accept the 500 and be consistent in his eyes and accept the Marian apparitions, then you and I, Bill, would just need to maybe consider becoming Catholic, but he didn't need to completely shift his worldview and open it up to the supernatural, which would be far more jarring to him than it would be to you and me. But nonetheless, I think you're absolutely right. The predisposition changes everything. I think it's fascinating. We look at the accounts of the disciples, like Mary sees Jesus, doesn't really understand, like, what is going on when they view him. The disciples on Emmaus, even when Jesus is there, they don't understand. So they're predisposed to the opposite. And you and I have to explain the apologetic question. If that really was Jesus, why didn't they believe? And so I think that predisposition, when you're told ahead of time, there will be this supernatural event, everybody shows up in a group. I think we have an adequate explanation for this that doesn't apply to the apostles.
Yeah. Notice Sean just walked right into that one. Yeah, why didn't they? Why do the Gospels preserve evidence of doubt? And we have this just plainly stated in Matthew, and then it gets fictionalized in tales after Matthew. And because once again, they're conflating later Gospels with Paul and with earlier Gospels, and so that we can't allow that to happen. The later Gospels are making these stories up, right? But they're still preserving this idea of doubt, and they're trying to fix it by embellishing stories that solve the doubt. So that's why you get doubting Thomas. That's why you get the dinner party in Luke and so on. These are things that are meant to like solve this problem of doubt that got brought up by Matthew that some doubted. But the preservation of the concept of doubt, that goes back to the core idea that these were visions which are less concrete than actually what Luke and John are portraying. And in fact, so this is evidence that in fact, what Luke and John are portraying is not what originally happened. They had to make up those stories to cover up what originally happened, which was more doubtable. It's more ambiguous as to do we trust these dreams? Do we trust these waking visions? Like is this real or not? That was a conversation being had is evidenced by the Gospels preserving this point, and then Luke and John trying to apologize for it and fix it. But it's not fixed in Matthew. Notice it doesn't talk about how it got fixed. So that argument actually he ends up refuting himself with that. And the idea of the antecedent beliefs, everything Craig said is false. I'm so tired of him just saying false things over and over again. No, so these are antecedent Jewish beliefs, that there would be a resurrection, that there would be a Messiah who would face tribulation, and some Jews believe that the Messiah would be the first to rise from the dead. And Paul says Jesus is the first to rise from the dead, from the general resurrection. It's the first fruits of the general resurrection. So the idea that the Messiah would die and be resurrected actually is entirely in accord with antecedent Jewish beliefs. In fact, we have even outright evidence of messianic interpretations of a dying Messiah. And this is a complex question. We're talking about in pre-Christian Jewish thought, particularly in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have it in Daniel 9. Daniel 9 talks about the Messiah, whose death will presage the end of the world. And for him, the one who rises is not the Messiah, but the archangel Michael, who shows up to resurrect the dead and so forth, but just within a few years after the death of the Messiah, the anointed one. And so Daniel 9 already creates the scriptural expectation that there will be a Messiah, some anointed person who's going to die, and their death is going to presage the near end of the world. The world's going to end any minute after that, like within a certain timeline, and the general resurrection will begin. So the idea of, the idea that God would not resurrect from the dead his own Messiah is, of course, that's not Jewish. The Jews obviously believed that God would resurrect his Messiah. So there's nothing antecedently improbable about any of this. Like the idea that the Messiah would die is already in Daniel 9. It's already starting the apocalyptic time clock, exactly like Christians seem to believe in. They think the end is going to arise any time now. Why would they think that? Well, because Daniel 9 has been fulfilled. The Messiah has been killed. Why do we think the resurrection is going to happen? Well, God rose Jesus from the dead as an illustration. The resurrection has begun, right? Like, so this is the whole idea. Like, this is all exactly framed in a way that makes complete sense within early Judaism. So there's the idea, of course, if there's a historical Jesus who ginned them up to all of this, there's the intense hope and finding the secret messages in Scripture confirming it. So just like when prophecy fails, just like in that UFO cult, there's this intense hope that he would be vindicated. So there's actually the opposite motive, this deep desire that some sign would confirm that Jesus really was the Messiah despite his death. And believing that he's risen from the dead to presage the general resurrection of the dead, that is exactly the kind of thing that they would come to believe in this nexus of concepts that they've built. So that it's entirely plausible within the context of early Judaism. It's not antecedently improbable. It's an expectation that would make sense at the time. I would also point out that Sean is claiming to bite the bullet, and if we said, well, what if we just believe the Marian apparitions, then we solve Alex's argument, right? But that's not the point. Alex's point is that because he mentions more of these, right? So are you going to believe the Constantinian one? Are you going to believe Buddhist visions, Muslim visions? Are you going to believe all of them, right? Like, is that what you're going to do? But the thing is Alex's point is that the vision isn't believable, right? That's the thing, is that the apparition, all they saw was dancing lights in the sky. Like, it's an easily explicable psychological event. It doesn't confirm anything. Mary didn't descend from the sky and have dinner with people, right? Like, it's a very ambiguous, clearly psychological event. And that's what Alex's point is. So you can't bite the bullet and say, well, I believe the Marian apparition, because you're then abandoning all epistemic reasonableness, because there's no epistemic reason to believe that Mary actually appeared or did a miracle or whatever. The Marian apparitions are clearly just psychological phenomena. And that's the thing, is like, if that's what you're going to base your religion on, well, you've just refuted your religion, because now you're saying you're just so gullible that you'll believe even obvious psychological encounters rather than actual concrete evidence. So he's basically confessing that he's abandoning the epistemic standard that we need to actually justify believing in anything. And so that's why Sean's argument there doesn't rescue him from Alex's point. Let's see, do I have anything else?
So first is Peter. There are 2 epistles in the New Testament attributed to this apostle, 1st and 2nd Peter. Importantly, most scholars do not think that Peter actually wrote both of these texts, especially 2nd Peter, which is one of the most disputed texts in the New Testament. They're still early texts, but probably not both written by Peter. At least one of them is likely a forgery. There are scholars who defend the Petrine authorship of both epistles, of course, but the consensus is against them.
We've talked about the appearances to the 500. We can talk about the appearances to the disciples. But what confidence do we have in particular for an appearance of Jesus to Peter?
The fact of a post-mortem appearance of Jesus to Peter is guaranteed by the list in the very old tradition handed on by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 5. It is vouchsafed by Paul's personal acquaintance with Peter. And then also in Luke 24:34, we have independent verification or attestation of this appearance. So no scholar today doubts that Peter had such an experience.
Part of the question is, do we just trust certain witnesses who we have a writing in their own words saying they've seen the risen Jesus? So Joe Rogan asks about people who witnessed the resurrection, or it is attributed to them as witnessing the resurrection. That was a piece of the discussion. So in 1 Corinthians 15, this is not Peter's own words, but it's Paul in an early creed referencing Peter. But we could also add there's multiple attestation of this in the different Gospels and, of course, in Acts. But what's interesting, and this would take us aside here, is that if Mark really does report some of the eyewitness account of Peter, as some of the early church fathers indicate, then in Mark 16:7, it says, tell his disciples and Peter, would be an interesting, at least indication in that direction, that Mark and Peter is just firmly aware and proclaiming that Jesus did appear to him. So I think that was some of the debate as it goes to 1 Peter. But nonetheless, for the reasons that we mentioned, although we don't have Peter in his own direct words saying this, given the early multiple accounts that we had, you're arguing that we are on solid ground confirming that there's early evidence for an appearance to Peter, and Peter believed this. Is that fair?
All right. But this is unanimous among New Testament scholarship. I remember the skeptical German New Testament critic Gerd Ludemann saying that it is historically certain. Now, those are his terms, not mine. Historically certain that Peter and the earliest disciples had experience of Jesus after his death, in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So no New Testament historian denies the historicity of the appearance to Peter.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I think what they're implying is that therefore Peter had dinner with the resurrected Jesus, right? Like that he met, Jesus showed up, looked like he did in life in a normal human body, sat down, let him touch him and all that stuff. But that's the mistake, right? Like, the reality is, yeah, sure. We can be very confident. I think Ludeman is correct. We can be very confident that the first person to receive a revelation, whether it was a dream or a waking vision, or claiming to have done so, that Peter was the first and that he got it all started. I think that not only we do have only like the one thing in 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul says Peter is first. But when in Romans 16:25-26, Paul says the gospel is learned through revelations, right? So that means that if Peter is the first, then he must have had an appearance, right? So you can triangulate this evidence even from Paul that clearly everybody knew that Peter had the first vision and is the first to report it. He probably inspired the other apostles who would not have been called apostles at that time, but his council of 12 to also claim to have visions as well, independently, and so on. So I think it's entirely plausible that Peter is the first and he did have an experience. The question is, and this is Alex's point, what kind of an appearance? What did Peter experience? Did he literally just have a dream, wake up and say, Jesus came to me in a dream and he said all these things? And everybody's like, wow, that's amazing. And the Holy Spirit is telling me that it's real. Like that's entirely compatible with everything Paul says, and so on. I would take a nitpick. I don't think, because since I agree with their conclusion, I do disagree with one of their methodologies here, which is that they cite Mark as independent testimony, but Mark is referencing 1 Corinthians 15, so he's not independent of 1 Corinthians 15. So you cannot cite Mark as an independent testimony to this fact. The only reference we have anywhere in ancient history that a real source, a primary source, is 1 Corinthians 15. That's the only place where we hear Peter saw Jesus first. It's not recorded anywhere else independently of that. So even like Acts, the Gospels and all that stuff, they're not independent of Paul. So you can't argue from that. Nonetheless, I do think there's enough evidence within Paul to agree that Peter had some sort of visionary experience of Jesus.
Okay. I'd like to add, if I can, Dale C. Allison Jr., writing in his book on the resurrection, he makes this point that can be the case, depending on the evidence that we're looking at, that books that come later don't necessarily negate the fact that there might be more historically reliable material. So the two things is, the one comment I would like to make is he says it is historically certain. Again, we get back to this point, like that kind of language of certainty. I know Bart Ehrman, people use him against you to totally debunk the idea, like it is certain, right? And there's this like weaponization I think the apologists are using here, but it is historically certain. And earlier you mentioned, and you're not the only scholar, I won't name which scholar actually critiqued this, and this will come out in the final product here, is that they themselves are doubtful of they look to the imperial cult and they actually say, actually, there were eyewitnesses that were feigned or intentionally. And here you go. These guys have like a free vacation as cult leaders of this movement.
This is a good point. I'm glad you brought this up. So in my answer, I was not being particular as to whether Peter did or was pretending to have a vision. This is very important. So yes, it is entirely possible that Peter is pretending to have had a vision, and he would have. And so when Paul is saying that Peter saw him first, he is relating something that is true in the sense that is what Peter said and what everybody else said, and it's historically true that he is the first one to claim to have seen Jesus. It's entirely still possible that Peter's making that up, and the same way that Joseph Smith did, the same way Muhammad did. Pick anybody, right? Like so. It's also possible that it was a genuine dream or a genuine waking vision. That goes back to the point I made earlier. Both are possible. And so when I say I agree with Ludeman that it is historically certain, I mean the claim, right? So that Peter claimed to have seen Jesus and he was the first to do so. I think that is true. Paul is not making that up. And so, yeah, you can get deeper into that and say, well, was Peter lying? Was he fibbing? Was he exaggerating, etc.? We don't have any data to tell one way or the other, right? So yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make, and I'm glad you brought that up.
And Allison, just to add his personal take, he thinks Now, of course, he's granting the Gospels are depicting something earlier somehow than Paul, and he makes this argument that he thinks the list in 1 Corinthians 15 is kind of Paul is like mostly focused on men, so he scratches any female experiences, but that Mary or some of the women actually were the first ones to have experienced some kind of appearance, a visionary experience or appearance, if you take the later Gospels, seem to be more concrete. So that he thinks it might have been a woman's experience before Peter and others.
I understand the argument. I disagree with it for the reason that it is based on a false premise, but it's a false premise that Christian apologists keep repeating, which is this idea that no one trusted women, that women were so inferior that they would never have a woman as the first revelator. That's just not true. So if it had been true that the first revelation came to Mary, she would be revered as the first revelator and she would be in the creed. And if they needed male confirmation, then they would say, and it was confirmed by Peter, yada, yada. Right. So they wouldn't erase her. If she was actually the first to see Jesus, she would be fundamental to the creed. She would not have been erased at all. So I don't think that's the case. Also, Paul, there are several passages in Paul where he appears to, like there's a Junius in Paul that actually is in the feminine. And so it suggests that, and he calls them an apostle. So it suggests that Paul's aware of women who are apostles and just takes it for granted that women could be apostles. And that's pretty good evidence, I think. And so that means when Paul says appeared to James and then the other apostles, that other apostles could include women. There's no particular reason why it wouldn't include women, if there were any, right? So it isn't necessary for Paul to go out of his way to erase women. If he thought women are among the apostles, he's covered them already. They're in there. So I think I don't think that the argument holds that we can argue for an earlier appearance to a woman. I think that's an evolution. That's why you don't see it in Mark, right? So the first appearance is of an angel reporting the appearance, right? So it's Mary doesn't see Jesus, she sees the angel. I think that gets ported into Mary, because you see in Luke, it gets a little more embellished, Mary's encounter. And then it's in John that you have the first time that Mary is the first one to run into Jesus. So it's a really, really late story, and it seems to be this sort of extended. Basically, the story is getting telescoped. It was Mary saw the angels first, becomes Mary saw Jesus first. And I think that's a late development. It's a historical, legendary development over time. I don't think it supports an earlier version of it.
Second is Paul. There are 13 epistles in the New Testament attributed to Paul, but many of these are also believed not to have actually been written by him. The consensus is that 7 of them are undisputedly his, whereas the rest are contested. Some, like 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are firmly believed to be pseudonymous, written by somebody else. But even if Paul wrote all of these letters, remember what we're looking for here. Remember what Rogan asked.
Some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection.
Paul never claims to have encountered the physically resurrected Jesus. Even his conversion story in Acts just describes him seeing a flash of light and hearing the voice of Christ while on the road to Damascus. He never even claimed to meet the risen Jesus in the flesh, which I think is what Rogan is looking for here.
Do we have reliable testimony that Paul saw Jesus in the flesh, not just as a vision or a spirit?
Well, now, in the Apostle Paul, we have the testimony of someone who claims to have actually been an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. His experience is recounted 3 times in the book of Acts and is confirmed by Paul's references to it in his own undisputed letters. Now, I'm not really sure what Alex means by seeing Jesus in the flesh, since it's the testimony of the New Testament that a resurrection body is radically different than our present mortal bodies. I think that the question is whether Paul saw simply a blinding light and heard the voice of Christ speaking to him, or whether he saw the bodily form of a person who spoke to him. And it's really hard to know exactly what Paul said. The evidence is not clear. But when Paul says elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, "Have I not seen Jesus, our Lord?" he uses exactly the same language that is used to describe the bodily appearances of Jesus to the other disciples. And so I think it's not at all unlikely. In fact, I'm kind of leaning in the direction of thinking that what Paul saw was the bodily image of a man in that blinding light that was the Lord Jesus.
Mm. Now, just for clarification, I think Alex says Paul never claims to have encountered the physically resurrected Jesus. Those are the words that he used. The way I asked it to you is just in terms of seeing him in the flesh. But here's my take, and tell me if you agree with this. Luke recounts Paul's conversion 3 times in Acts, like you said, and indicates there were sound and light. So this is not entirely a subjective internal experience.
Right.
1 Corinthians 15:8, Paul says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So his appearance would have come after the ascension of Jesus and thus had some differences from the other appearances. But Paul believes it was sufficient to place it on the same level and seemingly kind as the other disciples, which leans me towards some kind of bodily appearance that was there, but maybe with not just as much confidence as some of the others. Is that a fair nuance to you?
Yes, I think that would be a fair assessment, Sean. It's very clear that Paul regarded this experience on the Damascus Road not as a vision of Jesus. He had visions of Jesus at other times later in his ministry, but this was a unique one-time encounter with the risen Lord on the Damascus Road. And therefore, as you say, he's able to include himself in the list of witnesses to the resurrection appearances with a good conscience.
Yeah, there's a lot wrong there. Paul does not say out of time, so that's a bad translation. He says abortion. He says God appeared to him even though he was an abortion. And what he means is a miscarriage. He goes on in the next line. He explains what he means, and is because I persecuted the church. So he basically saying God appeared to me even though I was a monster, and turned me around, and now I'm no longer a monster. So that has nothing to do with the nature of the resurrection. There's no mention of an ascension having already happened at any point. It's the other way around, actually. So in verse 7, Paul says, appeared to James and all the apostles, including me. Right? So Paul is including himself in verse 7. So the appearance to all the apostles, Paul is assuming his appearance is the same. And note that Dr. Craig did this just before Sean tried to change the narrative to, oh no, Paul means after the ascension. No, Paul says there's no way that works with what Paul says. Paul doesn't say that. It doesn't fit with what he says. You can't do that. That's illegitimate use of his sourcing. Craig agreed with the idea that Paul must have seen Jesus the same way as the disciples. He says that. He uses that as an argument because they saw him bodily. When Paul says he saw them, that he saw just like other apostles did, that therefore Paul must have seen him bodily. But the problem is that argument works the other way around. That in fact, Paul's talking about revelations. He explicitly says in Galatians 1, it's a revelation. It's not with flesh. I did not meet with flesh and blood. I had a revelation of Jesus. And he says it's in me that he experienced Jesus. So the valence goes the other direction. So the order of it goes the other way. If Paul thought that he saw things the same way as the disciples, as Craig just said, and he says that he saw Jesus in a wishy-washy vision, not meeting a physical touch at Christ, then that means the other disciples did too, right? So that means Craig's own argument refutes what Sean just said. That in fact, Paul says it was just a vision, therefore the disciples, it's all visions all the way down. And that's all we can get out of Paul. There's no way to extract what Sean's trying to get out of it. You can't make that stuff up. You have to go by what Paul actually says. And it confirms that this is all visions. This is all psychological phenomena. It's not, dinner party Jesus. This is not like I met him, hung out with him, etc. Let's see if I go the other direction. Ascension. Yeah, I did all that. All right. So yeah, that's the problem with what they're saying there.
I will add some juicy ancient beef. You appeared on Line of Fire back in the day when you were young, and you were probably, I think you were still at the time a historicist, and you were debating William Lane Craig, and this is the exact same thing he said then where you asked him, you're not saying that Paul is like literally dealing with a flesh and blood Jesus like the later gospels say, are you? Well, yes, I am actually. He's trying to argue the bodily Lucan Johannine back into Paul.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what's happening, and there's no basis for it. All the evidence points in the other direction. That version, the Lucan Johannine version, is late embellishment. It's a late sort of dogmatic reaction to the earlier versions as it's evolving towards them. When you go back in time, it becomes defabulized as you go back, and you don't, eventually you don't have the touch it dinner Jesus. You just have, well, I saw someone on a hill that might have been Jesus. And then you go back and then it's like not even that much. And then you go back to Paul and it's a revelation. Right. So if you go back in time closer to the actual truth, you end up with the exact opposite of what Craig is arguing. And that's supports Alex's point.
And there's a similar problem with the fourth name that Wes mentions, James, whose epistle in the New Testament, again with some dispute over the authorship, also simply does not recount his witness to the resurrection. Wes is wrong to bring him up as well.
Here's the heart of the question, Bill, is we don't have the words of James in his epistle, even though there's debate about whether he wrote that or not, which is somewhat secondary. We don't have words of James himself saying, I've seen the risen Jesus, like we do with Paul. So do we have reason to believe, which Wes Huff cites and believes, that James is a reliable witness of the risen Jesus nonetheless?
The appearance to James is attested in the old tradition handed on by Paul, and it is vouchsafed by Paul himself, who knew James personally. Moreover, I think the appearance is historically plausible as the best explanation for why James, who did not believe in his older brother during his lifetime, suddenly became an ardent follower of Jesus afterward and was even martyred for his faith. So you do not need to have a person's own words describing his experience in order to be historically confident that that person did, in fact, witness such an event.
So I have sympathy for Alex because he's responding to certain books in the New Testament specifically that Wes laid out in terms of Jude and 1 Peter and James. I think that's why he's bringing in the apostleship here. But really, the key point that I think Wes was making, and maybe if he went back and had that conversation again, he might frame it and defend it a little bit differently, is that James is a reliable eyewitness of the risen Jesus, even if we don't have his own words saying that he's seen the risen Jesus. As best I can tell, there's actually three sources that are cited here. Of course, 1 Corinthians 15 that you cited, 7a. But John Dominic Crossan also cites the Gospel of Thomas 12, which is interesting. Even Gary Habermas is not persuaded by that. And then the Gospel of Hebrews, which is dated kind of the first half of the 2nd century. Now, I don't put a lot of credence in those. I think the main source is 1 Corinthians 15. But would you say, I guess I'm curious, how high would you rate our confidence in the appearance of James compared to Paul, where we have his own testimony, or Peter, where we have multiple accounts of it? How much historical confidence would you put in the appearance to James?
Well, I think it's right up there near the top. Now, of course, Paul is indisputable because we have letters from this man in which he talks about the appearance. But with respect to James, as I say, Paul knew James. He met with him during a 2-week period, just within 3 years after his own conversion on the Damascus Road. And James and Peter were telling him that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. And this was then mediated to Paul as well by this very old tradition that goes right back to the first few years of the Christian church in Jerusalem. So we're in contact here with someone, namely Paul, who spoke with James and tells us what he believed. And James then became the leader of the New Testament church, and as I say, was eventually martyred for his faith in Christ. Now, that's remarkable enough in itself, but when you reflect on the fact that James wasn't a follower of Jesus during his lifetime, you've got to have some kind of explanation for this transformation in James that took place. The crucifixion of his older brother wouldn't do it. That would only convince him more deeply that his messianic delusions were insane and brought about his demise. What would produce so transformative a change in James that he would now be willing to die for his belief in Jesus Christ? And I can't think of any better explanation than Paul's words, "Then he appeared to James."
Yeah, of course, people die for false beliefs all the time. People, whether they might genuinely believe something and die for it, or they might even die for a cause, knowing that they have to maintain the false claim to defend the cause and so on. So that whole dying for a lie thing, I have a whole article on dying for a lie. Did the apostles die for a lie? I have a whole article on that on my blog, and you can check that out at richardcarrier.info. But I want to skip past that because we actually don't have any evidence that any James died, because it all comes from super late legends, like literally apocryphal legends, non-canonical things that they just said that they don't believe, right? That we should reject non-canonical texts. So we have no canonical evidence that James, the James we're talking about, which is James, the brother of the Lord, was ever killed. That's not in the New Testament, and it's not. It appears only in later legends. So Book of Acts also, Dr. Craig is conflating James, the brother of the Lord. He's the one who's saying that he didn't believe in him during life. We'll get to that in a moment. But rather than James the apostle, who did believe in Jesus, he was one of the 12, right? So Acts has no brother of Jesus named James anywhere in the public history of Acts. So he's confusing different men named James. The James who's killed in Acts is killed by beheading, and that's the apostle. Right. So that's the disciple. That's not the one who became a believer after Jesus died. So he's confusing, I say conflating, because I think he's doing this on purpose, different people. So you can't get that argument. You can't get that he died for a lie out of a late legend that he died. So you can't trust what he died for or why or any of that stuff. So those legends are useless for that function. So he's using an even more implausible legend to try and bolster another legend, right? Like, so that's that kind of reasoning just doesn't work, and that's why it doesn't hold up in history. So also, even if it's worth pointing out also that Paul does not say the James that he's talking about in 1 Corinthians 15 is the brother of the Lord. He conspicuously doesn't say that. And in fact, this is one of the reasons that I and some other scholars think that James is an insertion, that Paul didn't write the word James, because it breaks the symmetry of the creed. It's redundant and doesn't serve any function. Whereas if you take it out and just keep the apostles, you end up with a more streamlined and symmetrical argument. But anyway, whether it's authentic or not, we don't know which James Paul is talking about. We don't know which kind of appearance he's talking about. We don't know how this James saw Jesus. It was just another revelation at better, just like we've been talking about. So it's actually useless for making any point that they want to make. And it is significant that the letter attributed to James, or at least a James, because note that the James of the letter also does not claim to be the brother of Jesus. That James also doesn't ever mention any of this. So you had access to a eyewitness, and they didn't tell you anything. So you have no information about what James supposedly saw or when. And it's also, if you point out, like, even if you try to insist that he has to be James the brother, we actually don't have any evidence that he didn't believe before Jesus died. Because there are scenes early in Jesus' ministry where he dismisses his family, but they never say what happens after that. So they don't say that maybe James turned around and joined the movement at some point, and they just doesn't get narrated in the Gospels. We have no evidence that he was adamantly an unbeliever when Jesus died and was converted to the faith. There's literally no text that says that James was an unbeliever. Jesus appeared to him as a risen body or a risen person and then convinced him. We've none of that. That's an invention of Christian apologists like Dr. Craig. All we have is this reference to an appearance to James that happened after the others. We know nothing about that appearance. It's not narrated in any gospel. It's not narrated in any, I think it's not even narrated in any non-canonical gospel. We have no sources for it. So there's nothing you can do with it. It's just the same as all the others. Romans 16:25-26, Paul says it's a revelation. That's all people's had. Galatians 1, it's a revelation. It happens in you. It's a psychological experience. So that would be the most likely thing that this James would have had. And even if it did convert him from non-belief, which Paul does not say, no other source says, that's entirely possible in the same way that Paul was converted from non-belief, because Paul himself says, I was a persecutor, and then Jesus appeared to me and changed my mind. And yeah, you could do that by faking it. You might have a social reason to want to switch sides. There are lots of really good reasons for Paul to have done that. It could also be genuine. Paul's guilty conscience could have caused him to have a dream or an experience that made him feel the Holy Spirit, feel that he's got to be right about something, that he was wrong about something, and that Christians are right about it, and he should get on board. Like, that could be a real experience, but it would just be a psychological phenomenon, a psychological event. It doesn't mean that any actual God appeared to him and told him anything.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard Dr. Richard Carrier. I mean, this has been a fantastic discussion and very illuminating to hear you from a critical side, dissecting an opponent. You've debated several times in the past, and the line of fire. If we're going to put a bow on this, I kind of want to just say this, and then wherever you want to go in terms of wrapping up this whole assessment of this video, and that is, the apologists have one conclusion, and it's not just one conclusion, it's a necessary conclusion that they must draw, and they want to kind of act like it's the logical, obvious conclusion, which makes everyone else, and by their what they're saying here, really, everyone else is ignorant, dumb, or something, because it's so obvious what they're getting as the conclusion.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you pointed that out. That's a good point, because, that is true. I was taking this for granted, but every one of their arguments is based on the snide, snobby assumption that Alex didn't think of this. No one thinks of this. Wow, how could he be so ignorant not to have thought of this? How did he not know this, etc.? I'm pretty sure he did think of it. I'm pretty sure he did know it, right? Like, I mean, it's not ignorance that's the issue here. The issue here is you're making shit up. Right? Like Craig made up a ton of premises, like the pre-Mark and passion narrative. Like, his whole apologetic in defense of that is bogus, right? It's just a crank made up thing. Like, there's no evidence for it, and all the evidence we have is against it. And so that's just the only one. You go back through the clips and see my comments and other things. You'll see that, he makes up premises a lot and bases his arguments on these bogus premises, and then hides the fact that they're bogus because he defends those premises elsewhere on a massively elaborate, specious apologetical argument. And so there's made up stuff. There's also stuff that's irrelevant. So notice that a lot of times they changed what Alex's argument was because they couldn't really respond to what he really said. Change it into something else that they could argue against, right? And hope you didn't notice that happened. And so there's a lot of these tactics you could see in what they're doing there, as well as the illogical arguments. So, like the assuming that, just blatantly assuming that when Paul says appearance, he means dinner party Jesus, right? And then not what Paul himself says, which is inner revelation Jesus, right? Like a not flesh, in me revelation, right? Like this. So this kind of conflation of facts sort of create an alternate version of reality, and then insist that everybody's stupid for not realizing it. This is intentional. This is a rhetorical device. It's just like Donald Trump, right? You project absolute confidence in whatever bullshit you're saying, and people will believe you simply because you're so confident, and you're it's like, how could they be like, you bluster? Like, how could they not have known this? It's so silly that they could have known this, yada, yada. That's a rhetorical psychological manipulation. If you look in it and think there's actually no logical basis for this attitude. So why am I allowing that emotion to affect my impression as to the validity of their argument? It should have the opposite effect. You should say, well, why are they trying to emotionally manipulate me with bullshit? And that's the question you need to ask. And it's the answer to that question that will lead you out of the delusion that they're marketing.
I actually had this problem when me and Neil did the critique video, that I was using your source, it wasn't Not the Impossible Faith, but the book that goes into Irenaeus and the sources for Mark's long.
A Hitler Homer Bible Christ, which has a chapter on the long ending of Mark, which is what you're talking about. Yeah.
I have never seen I've been around for a minute now on YouTube, not too long, but long enough, right? 4 or 5 years, MythVision's been around, and I've done some pretty critical stuff against Christians. This is like a phenomena that should be studied. I've never seen anything like this. Wes Huff did a video critiquing Neil. He made this wild claim that this only Mark leaves this gap, and that all the other texts don't, which is easily falsifiable in Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, like
Yeah,
and
you
even
could.
in
Yeah,
Vatican-
not unusual. Yeah, right.
Right. Well, when we critiqued him, literally, because he called Neil dishonest and then said was mostly false. When we did a criticism and said, dude, you're being dishonest. You're clearly wrong. Here's the evidence. I've never seen more comments, more dislikes. I almost have a 50-50 ratio where that triggered, coping fundamentalists that are like cult-like mentality followers of West cannot see how I just me and Neil falsified his claims. And then West came out and said that much through his buddy Steven, which we recorded with, to say, yeah, West took the video down and was wrong. They still think we're wrong.
Yeah, and notice how that explains, go full circle right to the back. Why did Christianity grow so successfully? That, right? Once you're committed, once you have that Holy Spirit, that feeling that makes you sure that it must be right, all evidence is relevant. So you fact checking is irrelevant. You could show them the corpse of Jesus, they won't believe it. Like there's literally no evidence that you could use to stop the roll up and the growth of the religion, as long as they have that feeling that it just feels right and must be true, right? And the same with like you've picked your man, I can't possibly believe that Paul or Peter are lying. Therefore, anybody who presents any evidence against anything they say must be the ones lying, right? Like it's this logic that guarantees the success of all religions that have ever been successful. It's this exact same like failure of epistemic reasoning, this adopting psychological reasons to believe something rather than, rational logic and evidence, right? Like logic and evidence are irrelevant. How you feel about what you believe, how you feel about your authority, your chosen authorities, it's all feels. It's all how you feel. It's not logic. And that's what makes things like Christianity originate. That's what makes the apostles believe that having a dream of Jesus is enough to conclude that Jesus really appeared to them. It's what allows all the people that they preach to believe that they must be telling the truth, because they're doing the same thing Craig does. They come in there with absolute arrogance and absolute confidence. How could they be so confident unless they're telling the truth? It's the same thing. And then that becomes what they call an emotional infection, right? It spreads. People pick up on that and like feel good about like the charismatic reaction to it. And then that spreads the religion. And it's all based on emotion. It's not based on actual like logical analysis of evidence.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Richard Carrier, man, you're so gangster at this. I love it.
And I did all this at sight. I had not seen any of these clips before. So
listen, I love you, man. I really, really do. I appreciate you. I hope more people will actually go get your books, study what you say, check out your blog, go support you on Patreon. And in fact, you've got me wanting to do another deep dive. Just listen, I am not a dogmatist. I know I've said on record, I'm a historicist. Like few things make sense as to why I think there might have been a guy this is based on, right? But let's peel Derek Lambert's ideas apart and allow Dr. Carrier to bring a scalpel and say, hey, let's think this through. Here's what I think. And
especially since everything you would likely say, I was there. I was here, right?
And I'm
so
trying to
now
act like
I know exactly how it felt to like that seems logical and so forth. And I know what it took to like finally make me not convinced by those arguments anymore. So I've been through it. And so, yeah, absolutely. That would be a useful conversation to have.
Look, I have no dogma here. Like it doesn't bother me if there was a dude or wasn't a dude.
Yeah. And me too, right? Like 1 in 3 chance there was a dude, like that's pretty good chance, right? Like it's entirely plausible that there was a dude. But yeah, that's why I think that this black and white reasoning, but the people react to this, right? Again, that's an emotional reaction. It's not a logical or rational reaction.
Thank you. All the links are in the description. Wait till you see the final product, ladies and gentlemen, and never forget, we are MythVision.